G'day, mate. 40 here. So on Friday, we got the announcement of a special prosecutor for the Hunter Biden matter. Can't imagine that this is good news for the Democrats or for President Joe Biden. So what? Two months ago, it looked like there was going to be some plea deal where Hunter Biden would just cop to a couple of misdemeanors and the whole thing would go away. Right? Doesn't look like that anymore. Let's get some commentary here from Robert Wright and Mickey Kaus.
People, but if they can really show something like what you're saying, then even if they can't show the money going to Biden himself, that should be kind of a little bit of a scandal, right? I mean, that's pretty shady.
I think so. I think my line is it's impeachable, but it doesn't mean I wouldn't vote for him under certain circumstances. But
I'm not sure it's. I would almost say the opposite. I'm not sure it's.
Okay, let's start off. Say good morning to Dooovid. Dooovid, how are you this morning?
Baruch Hashem, thank God.
Okay, great. So while I just fiddle around with a couple of technical things here on my end, talk to me about what's been going on with you since I spoke to you last.
I mean, personally, not that much. I was actually recognized by the city of Detroit for 10 years of chess coaching. So I guess that was nice. On Thursday, there was a 20th year anniversary of the Detroit City Chess Club, of which I've been a chess coach now for 10 years. And besides that, still doing my research, selling books, but not much advancement in my own personal streaming or life.
Okay, and
You there, Luke? Maybe you have microphone issues.
I asked, have you gone back to shul?
No, I didn't go back. In fact, I went. I told you I went for those two medical events. There's another medical event.
Do you
in like a week from now? And Michael came to my house Friday night, and we did the Friday prayers. And he was feeling really inspired. He was like wanting to move to Israel and make Aliyah. And I was thinking like, okay, like maybe I could bring him to the local Young Israel, but honestly, like I didn't even know. I mean, like I probably have to contact somebody, or if I could just show up Saturday morning. I know they have security, or and it made me feel kind of weird about it, because I mean it's the nature of synagogue where I'm not actually sure I could bring my friend who's like trying to convert.
Yeah, I understand that we've got much tighter security measures in place. So you're touching on something that I've often reflected on. When people embrace Orthodox Judaism as adults, either as converts or as Balei Tshuva, I've noticed they are often seeking in Orthodox Judaism things that Orthodox Judaism is not necessarily suited to primarily providing. They're usually seeking, if they're not doing it for pragmatic reasons, they're doing it to try to get a sense of meaning in their life, a sense of God in their life, but really they want to get a life where they like and respect themselves. And usually people who already like and respect themselves don't make a dramatic change like joining Orthodox Judaism. Do you have any thoughts on this?
Yeah, Mika, I lived in New York for a long time. I'm not sure. Have you seen the Frida Weisel YouTube page yet? The Satmar tours of Williamsburg.
I'm not sure. I haven't paid
I'll
attention.
put the link in the chat. I mean, it's not super interesting, but I'd say it's extremely different in New York than probably anywhere. Maybe LA, but probably not LA, because New York and in Israel, when you become Jewish, you're looking at a community that you're going to become a part of, and that community is large and powerful. So, like, here in Metro Detroit, there's a few thousand Orthodox Jews, but they live in the poorest part of at least the Oakland County of where the Jews live, and if you joined the Jews, uh, you wouldn't necessarily be looking forward to becoming integrating part of the Orthodox community. So if you talk like someone like Michael who lives, like 45 minutes out into the suburb, doesn't have too much connection with Jews at all, and almost zero connection with Orthodox Jews. It's more, him like you were talking like a personal identity thing that is connecting to Judaism and then a feel possibly towards Orthodoxy, as opposed to if you were actually in New York City where you saw Hasidim, you saw Orthodox Jews, or like Lakewood, and or you had some sort of connection to Israel, where you would have been thinking about it from the beginning of an integration within some sort of culture community.
Yeah, yeah. You're touching there on something that I noticed also, that I noticed a lot of people want to be part of Orthodox Judaism, but they're simply not prepared to make the sacrifices that are necessary to be a normal part of Orthodox Judaism. And so they often try to do it on the cheap by trying to get around the required sacrifices, such as moving to within walking distance of a synagogue, and then they are concerned that they don't fit in because they're not making the sacrifices necessary to fit in. But there is a substantial sacrifice required to pull off a conversion to Orthodox Judaism, not just a conversion in form, not just passing through the process, but actually making it real in your life after you've passed through the process. Any thoughts on the relatively large number of people, I think, who would love to be a part of Orthodox Judaism, but simply are not willing or not able to make the sacrifices necessary to be a part of Orthodox Judaism?
Yeah, I mean, the vast majority of people don't even realize the sacrifices involved. And even like, me saying, who successfully did it for many years, picked up, multiple languages, lived a different life. For periods of my life, you basically completely cut ties with my family, all my former friends and connections. And, then I still largely failed. And, then if you did successfully find a marriage partner and have children, of trying to raise your kids. So, I mean, if you find it interesting, I think this dichotomy of, if you look, maybe me or Michael, where um, I more just enjoy being an Orthodox Jew and interacting, and as a life outlook of how I do things, and the community part is more difficult because I don't necessarily really feel like I fit in with the community, or I'm a representative of um, a community. However, I like interacting with Gentiles and secular Jews and even fellow Orthodox Jews as an Orthodox Jew, but I never really integrated into the community, as opposed to integrating in the community. Like, I know when I went into Israel, yeah, I was in Or Samek, and you have the Kiruv rabbis, and versus what they tell you, versus my own perception, where I saw like I got to fit in with these Orthodox Jews, these Hasidic Jews, and like the gatekeeper approach, where the Orthodox Jews are like the gatekeeper who are going to say whether you're really Jewish or not. And Michael, maybe from his background, he's not really concerned with that. Like, he knows that almost no one has even heard of these rabbis, has met any of these rabbis, and he just enjoys interacting with his old family, his old friends, new people he meets as a Jew. And like, well, I'm, like kind of like you when you were streaming, I watch you be like, I'm an Orthodox Jew, and like I would have watched you like, you're not an Orthodox Jew, no way. Like if you were an Orthodox Jew, you would you're doing all this wrong. But from your perspective, you're like, well, go back to the ghetto. Saying like, I'm an Orthodox Jew and I'm going to keep on doing this, versus trying to actually fit into the ghetto. And so to say, I've tried to fit in the ghetto, and I saw it's like, okay, I mean, you got these rebbes, you got these rabbis, and you got to do whatever they tell you. You got to do all this stuff. You got to, and I wouldn't say it's impossible, because there are many people who succeed, but it's borderline impossible to, so to say, to convert and fit into Orthodox Judaism. But even here in Oak Park, Michigan, there's converts that I put it, maybe a better way to express it: we those who shun the outside world, so they shed their former identity and then take on a new identity within the confines of the Orthodox world, or there's those who convert and then use that as a new way to approach the outside world. And maybe you're the latter, where you didn't shed your old identity to hide within the confines of Orthodox Judaism. You put on like a new suit, and now you're approaching the outside world with that new suit, that new identity on.
So many topics you bring up there. So the most stable transition to Orthodox Judaism of which I've seen is the transition to Orthodox Judaism that seems to be primarily motivated by marriage. By you've already established a relationship with someone who's an Orthodox Jew, and so to get married and to build a family together, you convert to Orthodox Judaism. In your experience, is this the most stable basis for entry into Orthodox Judaism?
I mean, you must be talking LA, because like I think that's extremely rare. I mean, even here in like Metro Detroit, there might only be a handful of examples because they're going to frown on that. So like if you're outside Orthodox Judaism, like you reform or conservative, you're not going to bother converting Orthodox for marriage. And if you're Orthodox, the chance that you actually that's my phone ringing.
It's okay, go ahead. Take care of that.
It's not important. So it won't ring. The chance that you're actually going to be in a situation like that where you're going to be engaged to marry an Orthodox person, and the last hurdle is converting, is almost non-existent. So I mean, maybe in LA it's a different ballpark where you have all sorts of orthodoxy is on a much lower level, where you have Orthodox Jews in relations with non-Jews, and then they would convert to make the family happy. But I would say like you got a really weak Orthodox community in LA if that's the case.
There's something to what you say in that the level of commitment to Judaism, like the level of commitment to Christianity, is considerably attenuated on the West Coast compared to the East Coast. So I notice on the East Coast, people have much stronger, meaning the Northeast, not so much Florida. But I notice in the Northeast, people have much stronger ethnic ties. They have much stronger ties in general to their families. They have much stronger ties in general to their religion, to their schools, to traditional forms of identity seem to be much, much stronger. And so Judaism is much more rigorous, much more demanding from my experience on the northeast of the United States compared to the West Coast. What are the major patterns or genres that you've seen among people who convert to Orthodox Judaism and pass through the process and seemingly pull it off?
Well, just to go back before if you wanted to dwell on this, like because to me it's unfathomable what you're saying. Like, how is it possible that people convert to Orthodox Judaism for marriage? Like, I can't even like fathom the pathway of what does that look like? How is it possible? You're saying like there was an Orthodox Jew who was like dating a shiksa, and then like the only thing he needed was her to convert, so they converted her.
Yeah,
Like
I mean,
it's almost unfathomable. Like how does that even happen?
well, it happens hundreds of times a year in the United States. It's the prime mover behind conversion to Orthodox Judaism, because people primarily meet each other at work or if they're in a similar profession. And so particularly modern Orthodox Jews are almost always in the professions such as lawyer, doctor, dentist, accountant. And so if you haven't, married by the time you're 22, 24, which is kind of normal in Orthodox Judaism, but get into your late 20s and you meet someone at work, all right, the odds are pretty high that that person won't be Jewish. And so people fall in love, and Orthodox Jews are affected by the culture around them. And so falling in love is largely seen in the culture that surrounds us as the basis for getting married and forming a family. So yeah, I see this happening a lot with Orthodox Jews. I'm surprised that you consider it, virtually impossible.
Yeah, I mean, certainly in New York City, I don't think that's ever happened like that, because I mean, the community is so large, and there would be so many eyes upon a person that I'm saying like there's hundreds of thousands of Jewish girls that you could always be set up with, that and the delineation of orthodoxy usually is not modern Orthodox, where people would be you having beards or Hasidish or clearly dressed as Jewish, where it wouldn't you couldn't have like a relationship with the maybe if you're like in a modern Orthodox area or LA where very few people where there's a larger constituency of modern Orthodox than Orthodox, where the person's in the work world and their romantic partner doesn't know that they're Jewish or how seriously they take their Jewishness, and the relationship carries on for a while to the point where they'd consider getting married and they would need to convert. So like in Brooklyn or New York, uh, the differentiation would just be too strong. So if you're Orthodox, it would be obvious you're Orthodox. It would be obvious from the beginning that it's not going to work. That you'd have to convert, and so the likelihood that you'd fall in love and then find out that like, oh, you have to convert, and that you wouldn't know that up front, or that other people wouldn't know about it right away. That so if you're even in Metro Detroit, but so if you're in a romantic relationship with like a coworker, your fellow Orthodox Jews would almost definitely know about that at the beginning and put a stop to it, to not allow it to reach that level. So I'm guessing it's more something like in LA that just culturally would not be practical in New York, and that's why I say like I can think of almost no cases like that in my experience in New York, and then. I mean, if you wanted to respond or you want to say the pathways I saw
Okay,
to
I'll just respond. So, also, what you often get is that someone falls in love with someone who he or she believes is Jewish, and then finds out that they're not Jewish according to Orthodox law, even though the persons believe they're Jewish all their life because they grew up Reform or Conservative. So that happens. Also, many Balei Tshuva, all right, people who are not Orthodox, fall in love with someone who's not Jewish, and then along the way, the Jewish partner decides to become Orthodox, and their non-Jewish partner decides to come along for the ride. So feel free to respond to that. Otherwise, talk to me about the different
that just
genres
the
of
communities
conversion.
are too strong in Brooklyn for that to happen, because like the differentiation between Jewish and Balchuva, or you think you might be Jewish, like in Brooklyn, like you got the rabbis, like everybody's cousins or went to school. So it's like you're Orthodox, you went to an Orthodox school, and it's obvious. Like like I mean, unless like there's a rare case of somehow like a person from one of these questionable backgrounds somehow got into and went to one of these Orthodox schools. So like your marriage pool would be from fellow people who went to these schools, and if you're like a Balchuva or someone who thinks you might be Jewish, there's so many rabbis all over the place that would have put you through the ringer. I mean, and because I know that's what they went through with me. Like, they wanted to know my family records, they wanted to know my family ancestry, and I was put into a questionable category. And one of the reasons I was never applicable for marriage, because I was never able to conclusively demonstrate my Jewishness for marriage standards within the Orthodox. So so I see in LA where it's completely different than Brooklyn, where you have just like a subculture of Orthodox Jews that run their own thing. And in LA, I could imagine that it's that much different. I'm not sure if you could imagine Brooklyn being that much different, where there is no path to what you're talking about. There is no path to a romantic relationship between a Jew and a non-Jew that could end in conversion, except for a person who went off the derrick. So if like a person went off the derrick, left the community, was living in a non-Jewish area, and then fell in love, maybe like in terms of like trying to make their family happy to convert, or but almost in none of those cases would the person return to the mainstream Brooklyn Orthodox community. So like there are plenty of cases like that where people have a cousin or a brother who left the community and married, and maybe they went through, now they're modern Orthodox and went through a conversion. But like if they came back into Brooklyn, um they would be questioned on their Judaism permanently. And I remember like in Bubov, in various Hasidic yeshivas, um, even Bali Tshuva generally have to marry the children of Bali Tshuva, generally marry the children of other Bali Tshuva, because lineage is that important to people that even like 2 or 3 generations later, you're like, oh, my granddad was a Baal Tshuva, and like his yichus, his lineage was questionable. That the general community still does not want to intermarry or date with their children. So like in LA, I could picture that it's that different. I'm not sure if you could picture in Brooklyn it being that different to the other extent.
Yeah, I think we're probably both speaking out of our own experiences. So I doubt that 50% of Orthodox Jews on the East Coast live lives that are as closely regulated and scrutinized by the rabbis as you describe. I think you're talking about more traditional, verging on Haredi communities of which you're more aware. I am mostly aware of West Coast forms of Orthodox Judaism, which are considered considerably watered down compared to what you describe on the East Coast. Most, well, not most, but a large number of Orthodox Jews on the East Coast do not lead lives as regulated and scrutinized and as under the thumb of the rabbis as you describe. Most, or not most, many Orthodox Jews on the East Coast, a considerable number, approximating 50%, do not lead lives like this. Do you think I'm wrong?
No, I think you're right. So I thought it was interesting just to highlight that, and like said that when I was in Hasidic Brooklyn, where you actually have a Jewish neighborhood, where basically, I mean, we also talked about this in relation to the difference in New York and multiculturalism, because it's not Jews among whites. There's almost no whites there, and the Jews are largely representative of the whites. But there's Hebrew letters on the signs, and maybe half the people speak Yiddish as a first language, and a lot of these schools are Yiddish schools, and maybe on the Upper West Side, you could be right. Like even on the Upper West Side, where you have hundreds of thousands of Jews, still it's very common for them to take their yarmulke off, to use anglicized names, and it could be even on the Upper West Side of Manhattan that it's closer to what Luke is saying than what I'm saying. But like I live in Hasidic Brooklyn, and maybe it gets back to your next question about what are the pathways to conversion.
Wait, hang on before we go there. So tefillin date, I think that's probably largely a modern Orthodox thing. So tefillin date is when you're going out with someone and you take your tefillin along because you expect to spend the night with the woman. And so when you get up in the morning, you're going to want to put on your tefillin. So obviously there weren't a lot of tefillin dates in the Orthodox communities that you knew in New York.
Yeah, when we talked about this many times, and I think the difference from like Orthodox, modern Orthodox to Haredi is when you reach the Haredi level, you have no personal autonomy. Like if you miss Marev, like someone's gonna be like, "Where was he?" And almost everybody everybody you associate, you're gonna already have to be off the derrick to have a level of personal autonomy. I don't know if that makes sense to you. Like in sense, like like if you were in the Haredi community, everybody would know all of your friends. You would not be able to conceal a single like friend that the community doesn't know about. And if you disappeared for a day or two, everybody would know it. It was like, oh, Luke wasn't in shul, for the 3 times a day he's expected to be in shul, and it would be like, topic. Every single person that followed you or cared about you, or your haters would like, where was he? And it's meant to protect from the things that you're mentioning. And I mean, we've discussed that level of personal autonomy and the level of completely giving up any personal autonomy.
Yeah, and the other rejoinder I'd have, anyone who's spending time around non-Jews is going to be far more susceptible to falling in love with one, just like any woman who works is going to be much more vulnerable to having an affair than women who just stay home with the kids. So there are Haredi Jews who spend a great deal of their professional life around non-Jews, and so they're much more vulnerable to falling in love with a non-Jewish woman than those who don't spend a great deal of time around non-Jews. Is that fair?
Well, no, no. I mean, because like in the Hasidic community, only adult male businessmen spend time around non-Jews, and generally that would only be the case after they're married with children. So there would be basically no possibility for fraternization except for adult married men that already have children. And like generally in the Hasidic community, you don't enter the business world until you're married with children.
Okay, so what are the different types of conversions to Orthodox Judaism that you have seen that appear to be somewhat successful?
So I'll give 3 general paths. One is the incremental path, maybe like yours, where it moves from Reform to Conservative to Orthodox to even like Hasidic. And that could happen very rapidly or over a long period of time. I mean, a person within a few months of going to a Reform temple could come on to ultra Orthodoxy, or it could take many years or decades for that incremental process. The other is possibly people, maybe Michael is a case of that, like independent spiritual seekers for whatever reason, and maybe you're also somewhat a case like that before your incrementalism through like Dennis Prager or something, but just people from whatever personal development, largely outside of any connection to Jews or the Jewish community, start to affiliate as a Jew, start to study Judaism, and then it could move on to the incremental process. Like, but saying that it's a personal discovery process as opposed to a communal. You're in university and you start going to the Hillel House, and then you start going to the Reform Friday night prayers or things like that and get more into it. Versus a person who makes their own personal discovery and think I'm a Jew even before they meet Jews. And then the third case would be more like you're saying, and there'd be a whole bunch of various pathways where it'd be direct connection with the Orthodox community, where however it came to be that a Gentile has reached into the social circles of basically all Orthodox Jewish circles. So, whatever reason, it could be party circuits, it could be business, but where you have, or it could be a Gentile who just happens to live in an Orthodox area, but where the Gentile is a minority among a majority of Orthodox Jews and decides to culturally make the switch to the other side. So I would say those are the 3 major pathways, and I think you have a reasonable amount of all 3 of those.
And I would just add that those people who have led stable lives prior to conversion, the most likely to continue on with Orthodox Judaism after their conversion. Those people who've led chaotic lives prior to conversion are the most likely to not be able to sustain a conversion to Orthodox Judaism. People who have experienced life within community and are pleased to live within the confines of any community are going to be much better suited to converting to Orthodox Judaism than those who don't. Those with a generally pro-social orientation are going to be much more suited to conversion to Orthodox Judaism. Also, you need to earn an above average amount of money. And so those people who were leading a professional life where they were earning above average money prior to conversion, they're much more likely to be successful in a conversion to Orthodox Judaism than those who struggle to even earn an average amount of money. So people with better life skills, people who are more competent, people who are more at ease with themselves and other people, people who earn money, who handle money responsibly, who handle alcohol responsibly, who handle the natural passions of life responsibly prior to conversion, much more likely to be able to continue on with a conversion to Orthodox Judaism after they've passed through the formal stages. So what happens when you convert to Orthodox Judaism is that whatever's going on with you internally prior to the conversion, or whatever your habits were with money, with the natural passions, with other people, with yourself prior to conversion, those habits are just going to continue. They just may express themselves in different language and in different circumstances. But if you had a problem with the opposite sex prior to conversion, if you had a problem with anger or depression prior to conversion, those problems are going to continue after your conversion. Any thoughts?
Yeah, we can definitely. Although, a Hasidic friend, you say like normal in America is being able to hide your problems, and it depends how normal you are. So, like they said, like if you're here in Metro Detroit, and you come from the more higher social economic places, uh, converting to Orthodox Judaism, joining their community might be a downgrade, and I would probably guess it's like that in LA. So I'm guessing like where you are in LA, it might be modern Orthodox, it might be relatively quite wealthy, and most of the people have college educations and secular careers that include respect from non-Jews. However, certainly today, I would almost guarantee that the actual rabbis who oversee Orthodox conversion, none of those people have a college degree, and they're probably in the more ghettoized part of Los Angeles that you might be able to convert in your area, be an Orthodox Jew, but you have to go to the ghettoized part of Orthodox Judaism, pass a bunch of rabbis that have no university education, and is in a lower social economic place than where you currently are residing and integrating with your Jewish community.
Yeah,
The gate.
I've never seen anyone convert to Orthodox Judaism and have a lifestyle downgrade. So what you've seen, I have not seen. Now, in Los Angeles, if you're converting to
Hollywood, can you convert in Hollywood, or you have to go? I don't know where the Orthodox community is, but I would assume that the rabbinic court that converts you is not in Hollywood. It's in the mainstream black hat area of town. And so if you're from Hollywood and you convert and you decide to move to the black hat area of town, that's a downgrade.
Well, the areas of town where the Jews live are not downgrades. There's Hancock Park and there's Beverly Hills, basically, and those areas surrounding that, and then the Valley Village in the San Fernando Valley. So these are all relatively upscale. Now,
where's the rabbinic court headquartered?
There's not one rabbinic court. It's not like Detroit. We've got at least 12 conversion to Orthodox Judaism Bate Din Jewish law courts in Los Angeles.
Okay, so it may be different there, but and also the social economic. So I mean, relatively, like, okay, in Metro Detroit, Oak Park is upper middle class neighborhood, but it borders Detroit, and relative to the Jewish community, Oak Park is the poorest Jewish neighborhood. If you looked at home values, maybe home values in Oak Park are like 150,000 on average. In my neighborhood, now with inflation, let's say 250,000 on average, and further out in the suburbs, maybe like 500,000 on average. And the Orthodox community is confined to the areas up to about $200,000 in home value. So if you're coming from Detroit, where the average home value might be $30,000, or outside of the suburbs, but if you're coming from the better parts, social economic parts of the suburbs, a conversion to, and I've seen it a handful of times, that if you're from a nicer area of Metro Detroit and convert, in order to live with the Orthodox Jewish community, you're going to have to make a social economic downgrade, and then say in the black hat part of town, college education is not necessarily respected. So like, your part of town, maybe all the Jews are college educated. However, in Oak Park, maybe less than 10% of the Jews are college educated. And then certainly in Brooklyn, it'll be a huge differential. Like I lived in the 5 towns, and like, so in New York, like the Long Island, the 5 towns where the average home value may be even $1 million, they have an Orthodox section, they have their own conversion court. But like, if you're from the 5 towns and grew up going to elite high schools, and had your own car at 16 and were expected to go to good universities, the cultural transition to the Orthodox part of town would be huge, because almost none of those people would go to university. Most of those people would be relatively poor. Maybe even a third of them would be on government aid and welfare programs. They're like, we've talked about this many times, where you said in your part of town, you don't have beggars coming to shul, but like in the Orthodox,
I never, ever in a million years said we don't have beggars coming to shul. Of course we have beggars coming to shul.
But I mean, they don't come directly up and hit you up.
Yes, they come directly up and hit you up while you're davening.
Okay, and that's even in
Beverly Hills.
Yeah, so but I was saying like the comparison to like the yeshiva part of town is probably tenfold.
I
Like
don't know about
if
that
you went,
because the beggars are smart. They go where the money is.
um well, I mean, it could be, but I mean they try to make it less welcoming. So I mean even at the Young Israel near my house, um, they worked out a system where they're expected to go to the rabbi, and the rabbi will give them a donation on behalf of the congregation, as opposed to individually going up to people. And at least here, they've been able to maintain that system. And various places like in the five towns or something like that, they'll have some sort of system where that call like a gabbai tzedakah, and so that and I know my parents were the cultural shock, but even at that level, like the security, like I had an old friend from Borough Park call me a month ago, and he was telling me like I was telling him about security and like all the shuls, like security guards, and he said like in the Hasidic parts of Brooklyn, the synagogues still have open doors. Like you could just walk in, open doors to any synagogue, and so that it makes it. But I mean, we were making the point about a downgrade so most converts who convert to Judaism is an upgrade in their social economic status. But there are
Well,
cases
in your
where conversion
experience,
to Judaism would be a downgrade in their social economic status.
yeah, in my experience, most conversions to Orthodox Judaism in Los Angeles are not a downgrade because most people who live in Los Angeles who are middle class are upwardly mobile. Those who are downwardly mobile move from California because it's so competitive and expensive. But let me move on to a slightly different topic. One of the least stable bases that I've noticed that leads people to convert to Orthodox Judaism is an experience with the light or an experience with God, some kind of transcendental experience, such as through meditation or drugs or some other gift where people are given an experience of the infinite. And this is, I think, a very common basis for conversion to Christianity. It's not usually a stable basis for a conversion to Orthodox Judaism. Any thoughts on this?
Yeah, I was meaning to mention that before we got off on that side tangent and maybe Michael would be a case of someone that feels like I'm Jewish. I don't need these rabbis to convert me. Like I know I'm a Jew, and that's their own personal identity. They've adapted, and I don't know if you felt like that, where at some point when I mean, people watching know your story with your chronic fatigue syndrome, and you woke up one day and just like I'm a Jew, and you didn't feel like you needed gatekeepers within the Jewish community to affirm it, or that wasn't your case. But you do have a strong element of people that they're just like I'm a Jew. I don't need any Jews or rabbinic court to affirm it. And those people probably have a harder time succeeding, although it might be the majority of people who attempt to convert to Orthodox Judaism are these people who feel like that, where they just, whatever reason, determine that they're Jewish, and it bothers them, the authority structure that they have to go through as a person who, be like, I want to be a Jew, and I'm willing to do whatever these rabbis tell me it takes to become a Jew.
Right. So I never thought that becoming Jewish was just something that I could do autonomously. So I've always understood that my identity is something that is, I would like to think I always understood this, as something that's jointly created. It's virtually impossible to sustain a personal identity that everybody around you denies and degrades and denigrates. So anyone who tries to pull that off, it verges on the impossible if you're not getting any support for it. We can really only sustain identities, including Jewish, if they are supported by a community, by people. We need other people.
Would you agree with my estimate? The majority of converts are probably of the A type that think that they're Jewish and don't need to convert, and that's why they don't make it, or you don't think that that's the majority of converts?
Well,
Or
wait.
people who
If we
attempt to
hang on.
convert?
If we're just talking about converts to Orthodox Judaism, then by definition, if they don't make it, they're not converts in this conversation. So
Yes, I
those
mean
people,
attemptee converts, that maybe even half of attemptee converts are people that have just decided that they're Jewish and don't really want to respect the conversion process, but that's actually the majority, and that's why the majority fail.
Yeah, I think there are a lot of people like that, and they don't really matter to the Orthodox Jewish community because they get weeded out fairly ruthlessly. They're not able to sustain their illusion for very long.
Yeah, but from a Chabad perspective, they get weeded out of the Orthodox community, but usually those people stick around, and usually those people will loosely befriend Jews on the exterior of the community and will still possibly the rest of their life or for large periods of time present themselves as Jewish to non-Jews. And I mean, it's an identity. So it could be there'd be a crash in identity where the person's like, I'm Jewish, I woke up, I'm Jewish. And they might go with that for like 10 years and then they just change their mind. Or sometimes they'll die like that. But they might get weeded out of the Orthodox community, but you know, they don't disappear.
Yeah, I think that's fair. And there's a tremendous amount of fluidity in identity in America today, which even affects both Orthodox Jews and those who wish to be Orthodox Jews. So I've known Orthodox Jews. I think one in particular I'm thinking of right now. I think she was born Jewish, became Orthodox for marriage. Then when her marriage ended, she went off and married a Mormon and lived in Utah. Another woman converted to Orthodox Judaism, got married to a Jewish man. They had Jewish kids, but then they got a divorce when the kids became adults, and then she completely left everything behind. So there's a tremendous fluidity in identity, particularly those who are more modern and more associated with the general American society compared to those in Haredi forms of Judaism.
When you said that, it made me think of an interesting point, and I would say that I would guess that very few people want to become Orthodox Jews. They just see Orthodox Judaism as the gatekeeping to legitimate conversion, and they might go through it for seeking legitimacy of the conversion, and then see like they've passed the level. They're a Jew now according to Orthodox standards, but they don't necessarily. And I'm not sure in LA. Like I mean, certainly now I would guess less likely. Maybe when you converted, modern Orthodox Jews had more power. But I think in the last few years they've really hollowed out the modern Orthodox conversion process. And if you did want to convert, you would have to get through the yeshivish Orthodox conversion process, and then you could become modern Orthodox. But the actual rabbis who would convert you would not be modern Orthodox. Certainly Metro Detroit. Maybe in LA they still have a few. Do they have like a modern Orthodox bet-in that can do conversions?
Yes, but you're right that the Haredi are steadily taking over Jewish life in America and in Israel, that they are increasingly effective at flexing their power and getting what they want.
So, I mean, you could still be like, you could still, so to say, like, I think you were more Orthodox, like you did Black Hat Judaism for a few years.
Yeah, but as I've told you many times, I'm not going to get into the weeds and the details of much of my Orthodox experience.
But I was saying that, so to say, you had to pass those gatekeepers in order to get into the modern Orthodox community. So it wasn't, you didn't want to be, maybe you did at the time, but like you wanted to, so to say, be a modern Orthodox Jew, but you had to pass the gatekeepers of Black Hat Orthodoxy.
Right. You keep wanting to bring it back to me. Every time we have a discussion, you keep wanting to bring it back to my personal life, and I'm not going to go there. So I put my own personal welfare.
Very few people want to be Black Hat Orthodox Jews. It's just that they're the gatekeepers for conversion. So when the person's goal is to pass the gatekeepers and then be Jewish at their own level, and they just see like whatever reason, maybe they distaste it even after their conversion, or not, that they say these guys are the gatekeepers. They have to pass through the gatekeepers, and then they could be Jewish at their own level, like most Jews. And so I would say very few people who convert actually want to be part of the ultra-Orthodox community. They just want to pass those gatekeepers.
There's something to that, but I think there's even more to, there's a large number of Orthodox Jews who would love to be modern Orthodox, but they simply can't afford it. And so they choose other forms of Orthodox Judaism simply because they cannot afford the expense of modern Orthodox life. It costs about half as much to send your kids to a traditional Orthodox Jewish school than to a modern Orthodox Jewish school.
Yeah,
So
I guess that
you send your kids to a modern Orthodox Jewish high school. Tuition without financial aid is going to run you over $40,000 a year. But you can often send your kids to a traditional Orthodox high school for $20,000 a year.
Yeah, when we discussed this in the past, I mentioned I did food stamps, and when I first got to Borough Park and was integrating into the Hasidic community, a lot of the people advising me told me I should apply for minimally food stamps and maybe like welfare or Medicaid. And I had too much pride. I didn't want to do that. But even the rabbis at the time, that is like, okay, like you got to get on food stamps and whatever government programs you're eligible for. And I ended up working. I ended up I didn't need to do that, but I ended up working for the person that filled out the forms to do that. And so so if you make it into the Orthodox community, you could live on charity and government programs in the schools. So even if you have no money, your kids are gonna be able to go to the Orthodox school. The modern Orthodox in Metro Detroit is small enough that I think actually a lot of the converts do end up going to the modern Orthodox school, but it could be a unique situation where there's such a small modern Orthodox community compared to the Orthodox community that there's excess funding in scholarship programs to allow the handful of kids of converts from the Black Hat community to go to the modern Orthodox school. But like in New York or LA, where you probably have modern Orthodox schools that cost like $20,000-$30,000 a year, it would be a completely different ballpark, and they're not necessarily going to have sympathy on you because you converted to Judaism to give your kid a scholarship. And then also you're probably among elites that like they went to good universities and have professional careers, and just allowing somebody to get a scholarship to their school because they successfully converted to Orthodox Judaism would not be conducive to their children's success.
Yeah, so here's another maladaptive thing that I see going on by many people who want to convert to Orthodox Judaism is that they have delusions about the nature of Orthodox Jews. They frequently assume that most Orthodox Jews are close to God. And the reality is that Orthodox Jews are about as susceptible to many of the problems that plague people, outside of Orthodox Judaism. So just knowing that someone's an Orthodox Jew doesn't mean that they're more likely to be nice, that they're more likely to be honest in business, doesn't mean that they're less likely to try to sexually take advantage of you or to financially take advantage of you. So here's a very common trajectory I see. People become attracted to Orthodox Judaism because they have all sorts of delusions about the nature of Orthodox Jews. Then when they encounter the reality of Orthodox Jews, and my experience of Orthodox Jews is not universal, but my experience of Orthodox Jews is that they are no more likely to be honest, decent, trustworthy, and non-predatory as people who are not Orthodox Jews. So when they finally start repeatedly getting humiliated and taken advantage of because of their naivete about Orthodox Jews, they then lose their enthusiasm, lose their faith in Orthodox Judaism. They become disillusioned and either drop out of the pursuit of Orthodox Judaism or completely drop out of Judaism altogether. Any thoughts on this phenomenon?
Yeah, I mean, definitely. And we've talked about that many times, that yeah, I mean, and it's unfortunate. And like I was somewhat naive in Brooklyn, although I'm from Detroit, a little street savvy too. But you certainly, you may not expect people to scam you, steal you, or even God forbid, sexual molestation or anything. People are people, and if you have an idealistic view of Jews, they're still just people, and you will be susceptible to that. But I mean, maybe bring it back, because we've talked about this in the past about modern Orthodoxy is really like somewhat like an elite status, largely due to the social economic structure of America, because generally modern Orthodox Jews exist in upper middle class neighborhoods. And on both levels, like modern Orthodoxy is a best of both worlds hypothesis. And just on like a secular non-Jewish level, the ability to be modern Orthodox, you basically have to be upper middle class, successful, professional, earning like near $100,000 a year, which let alone generally modern Orthodox Jews on a Jewish level need to be able to subsist and live in a black hat Orthodox community should they need to. That like, okay, modern Orthodox Jews might not agree with it, but like almost all modern Orthodox Jews, if they needed to, could go into the black hat section of town and participate and live that lifestyle also. So it's really near like a, if you want to use the word elite, but it's a very difficult status to reach because you have to achieve excellence in two realms, and especially the excellence in the secular realm that is beyond the reach of most Orthodox Jews, and certainly most converts, that you're going to be expected to convert to Orthodox Judaism, pick up all this stuff, and also to become a successful professional in the secular world is near impossible.
Well, it's certainly challenging, and it winnows out the numbers of people who can keep up such a challenging way of life. So we've often spoken on this show about the book Virtually You, The Dangerous Powers of the E-Personality. So just to recap those basic points, that there is a compulsive nature of a lot of people's internet use that can be compared to obsessive compulsive disorder. There's often a euphoric high to going online, and we often develop exaggerated personality traits from our online performances. So we often tend to become grandiose. We often tend to become more impulsive in our online personas. We often tend to develop an exaggerated sense of our own abilities. We often share dark things that we wouldn't share if we were getting visual cues from the people we talk to. And so often this new, somewhat pathological e-personality then feeds back into our regular self and damages our real life relationships. Would you agree, Dooovid, that for the live streamers we've known, a large number of them seem to have developed increasingly negative character traits that can be probably ascribed in part to their live streaming?
Yeah, I was thinking, like Adam Green like messaged me. He was like, "Who's this guy like Ultra T?" And I said like, like I don't know. I mean, but like like it's like he's been trolling me for like 5 years now, and then thinking like my own chat, I was even joking to another streamer saying like your imaginary friends, like these anon people in your chat are really just your imaginary friends. They don't like, I mean, they exist to some extent, but to some extent they don't really exist. And because I also stream chess, there's a certain element of you being really good at chess, and people might watch and play chess, although like a lot of people are anonymous too, and they're just imaginary friends, and there is basically impossible to convert those into real life. And that's why I've let my viewership go down, because like, do I really want to have long-term relationship with imaginary friends? And then I could see like, well, if I'm going to say like you got to tell me who you are, you got to dox yourself to me, then people don't want to do that, because I got like a wide variety of people that don't necessarily like the other type people that view my programming. And so it's like, well, I don't mind telling you who I am, but I don't want other people. It actually goes back to when I was in Hasidic Brooklyn. I had a lot of Hasidic friends, and they didn't mind being friends with me, but they didn't want their other Hasidic friends to know that they were friends with me, or they didn't want to be, my other Hasidic friends for me, like, mention them to them, because it wouldn't have fit their overall self-perception of their identity. So like on the streaming level, I mean, it's a fake personality that most people have developed. And to think, okay, like, I mean, God forbid you got Gunner in the chat or something like that, like 5 years now, like I mean, he's got identity issues. I'm not, like a psychoanalyze him saying anything good or bad, but think like, God forbid, like, do I really want to be in a in chats for like, decades? And do I really want to have long-term relationships with imaginary friends?
Okay, I want to get back to this topic, but I just suddenly flashed back to something that you said at the beginning of today's stream that you've often brought up, and just ask you a question about. You mentioned how the rabbis and the traditional Jewish communities that you're a part of looked at you with a great deal of skepticism due to you having one non-Jewish parent, and that made it more difficult for you to find a shidduch, a match, a marriage in traditional Orthodox Judaism. So here's my open-ended question. Is it easier for you to blame your bachelorhood in particular and other life problems in general on the status of having a non-Jewish parent and the power structure's reactions to that, as opposed to not having something like that to blame problems on?
I don't necessarily blame it, but I mean, certainly it was an important factor, and because we've been talking about a lot the difference between modern Orthodoxy and Haredism. So like among the Haredi, it was just kind of accepted that I would marry someone like myself. That it was just like a non-issue. Like, of course, you're not going to marry within our community. It's just not going to happen. Like it doesn't happen. We don't do that. And even like my local modern Orthodox community, generally they're like, your mother's Jewish, you're 100% Jewish. But the difference in Haredi culture, it was just like a given that I would not be able to marry within their community, and at best I would marry someone else that tried to integrate in their community like myself. And they had people like that. So like in the large Hasidic community.
Wait, this wasn't my question. I was just asking, do you get a psychic payoff to having a ready-made narrative that explains your problems and difficulties and failures in life?
No, I don't consider it like a excuse or reason. I think my status of with Judaism is one of the larger reasons I haven't been able to successfully marry, and that would go across the board. Like saying like if I'm going to marry a non-Jew, then what's with my Jewish status? And I never kind of like a failed Baal Tshuva. So I mean, some extent, you like if I just jumped in and wanted to get married, it might have been a good excuse for me to avoid dating and avoid getting married, was my kind of like failed Jewish status. That, but I don't necessarily. It probably on the other end that I've used it as an excuse to not date and not get married, as opposed to a personal excuse I give myself for blaming Judaism for being single.
So I've got my own, ready, handy narratives about failures. So if someone's asked me, hey, Luke, you're 57, you have some abilities where if you never married, I got a ready-made narrative. I'll just say, unfortunately, I've been vegetarian my whole life, and until 2 years ago, I've had horrible health. So there's my like ready-made narrative that explains my failures. It's much easier for me to have that ready-made narrative just ready to go, ready to hand off to anyone who asks, rather than say it's a result of who I am and my own poor choices and my own poor character. So you've sent me links about, I think, narrative therapy. Do you have any thoughts that you want to share on the relief that you may get or other people may get from having a ready-made narrative ready to go that explains most or all of one's failures in life?
Yeah, well, narrative identity is a psychological theory of identity, and then based on that, there's a specific type of psychotherapy that's narrative therapy. So, like, narrative identity is, I don't think it's controversial. It's one of the main theories of identity in psychology, and if you prescribe to that school of identity, then there would be a specific therapy based on that. And yeah, I guess I'm like you. So people ask me like, why you're not married generally, or a lot of people even assume I'm married, or you ask me about my children, and so I never found the right woman, and I'm kind of eccentric, and it is very difficult for me to find the right woman. And if they ask me more about that, uh, my relationship to Judaism would just be one of the reasons that I'm eccentric. But I'm not sure if you want to go.
Well, do you get relief from having like a ready-made explanation, a ready-made narrative to offer people who ask, embarrassing personal questions like this?
Well, I don't know if it's relief. I put like narrative is not like an excuse. Narrative is a factual part of identity. My identity is my narrative, and saying like I am the person who went to Israel at 18 and became ultra orthodox, and all these various things. That's the factual that you there, as opposed to there's role identity theory, and then there might be trait identity theory, to say that my identity is a set of characteristics that are defining of me, as opposed to my identity is based off of my life story. And
Well, yeah,
so
but
I don't.
you keep wanting to abstract away from the more personal question. If you don't want to answer the personal question, that's fine. But what do you do when people ask you embarrassing questions? Bringing to light things that you're not thrilled about.
I usually use self-deprecating humor.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, maybe that's kind of what you're doing also, but someone does press me, I'll just say something self-deprecating, and if they respond on it, I might go, if I see that they kind of are taking the attitude that what's wrong with you? Like, there's obviously something wrong with you, and then they're just trying to figure out what's wrong with me. Then I'll just use some sort of self-deprecating form of humor to try to give them some bit of embarrassing personal information about myself, where that could make them understand, like, oh, there is something wrong with you, and that explains why you are who you are. And if that's kind of what you're saying you're doing.
Yeah. So let me just keep drilling here, kind of like a dentist on a sore tooth. But would you agree with me that one of the greatest resources you can have is to have a valid basis for liking and respecting yourself?
Yeah, I mean, there's healthy realism, and that's part of narrative identity, and the dissonance between the false narrative that I feed myself, or it could be a distorted negative narrative, versus so to say, the actual true narrative of who you are and why you became the way you are. And so narrative therapy would try to work out something like that, like, who is the real you? What are the false narratives you've built up versus the objective life experience you have? What is the narrative that you portray to other people, and why does that cause us to get into problems? And in terms of, like, if you want to, maybe me and you, the biggest fault anyone would basically say, like, well, you're both old bachelors, like, there must obviously be something wrong with you, that you both that we've both failed in one of the most fundamental things of what it means to be a man. And in some sort of like narrative therapy, to say, well, what's your narrative, what's your story that leads to you being here today? And if it's like we're focusing on this failure that we both admit, that we both have failed to build up families, I've never seen a narrative therapist. I don't know how they would deal with it. Like, I showed you that McAdams book just to show you that there was a thing, and I thought you'd find it interesting. I don't know if I don't even know of any like local people who do narrative therapy, or how they'd go about it.
Yeah. So for me, one of the advantages of live streaming and having to interact with strangers is that strangers will find it easier to give you honest feedback, or to ask honest questions than people face to face. And also, one of the advantages of getting older is that we can get better at writing, or having in our head some kind of narrative for our life that enables us to feel some kind of valid self-respect and self-regard. Do you agree that getting older makes it easier to form a narrative? I mean, what do you do in your own head when painful things come up for you, and you're kind of wrestling or uncomfortable with some part of your life? If you found as you've aged, you become better at developing some kind of coping narrative about why you are where you are in life, or if you found benefit from the sometimes brutal exchange with strangers online about the state of your life and any impetus that may have provided for developing a narrative of your life that works for you.
Look, I've definitely overanalyzed this and researched it and thought about it, probably more than most people. So I largely accept that it's beyond my knowledge level that, like the multiple truth hypothesis, that there's some theoretically like objective narrative or who I am. And then I have multiple possible narratives that explain me. And then there's other people, including my family and loved ones, people who've known me, how people perceive me, that have alternative narratives. Versus we were talking like truth and the correspondence view of truth. So if you're gonna say theoretically there's one truth, one narrative that truly corresponds to who I am, versus saying there's elements of truth in all the various narratives, and like a role identity that depending on the situation I might fall into a role. And we've been talking long enough that I'm more on the depressive side, maybe you're on the more happy side, so I could accept kind of like self-deprecating situations of just like, oh, okay, maybe I'm messed up, maybe no one does like me, and so I might even dwell too much on narratives like that, and you might have the opposite issue where you're focusing on overly positive narratives.
Yeah, I can't live stream really effectively unless I'm in the middle of some kind of coherent, at least for me anyway, narrative of my life that enables me to like and respect myself. So often when you don't see me live streaming or hardly live streaming for weeks on end, it's because my narrative of myself has blown up. And so there were years where I hardly made any YouTube videos between 2012 and 2014 because I couldn't sustain a positive, sufficiently positive and respect-worthy narrative of my life that would enable me to come online and to bare my soul, so to speak. So does any of that ring true for you?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, live streaming definitely blew up my narrative. And you just mentioned like, Gunner in the chat or something like that, just to have like kind of like consistent negative feedback or trolling. And, like for years, you just like anything I do, like that's a lie, that's not true, is much more in your face than reality. Like people might be thinking that, like I was saying, like, I went to the local shul, and it's like, well, I might have a fear factor. That's what people are thinking, but no one said that. No one treated me, poorly. But streaming, like people are definitely, critical. Even like, I mean, Gunner, like even Halsey, if you say, like, like rejecting that I'm Jewish, like I lied, I made up going to Israel, I made up studying yeshiva. And I could see that, like I could see like, probably I walk around and think, you're not a real Jew, you didn't really study in Israel, or something like that. And there's probably people thinking that, but I've never been confronted on that. But like the internet, I would say it's almost like always, every time I present myself, like it's always like, you're not really Jewish, you didn't really do these things. And that's what led me to my research. And so you're different because you're streaming. I mean, you're similar to me in some ways, but your streaming is also a lot about you, and you tell a lot of personal stories, as opposed to my streaming is much less about me. And I'm just the guy who's like doing research, sharing some interesting things that I'm thinking about and saying, like, I mean, certainly a large part of your streaming is that also, but generally when I stream, it's not about me at all, and just like I'll be talking about this topic, and then occasionally like I'll throw in like a personal story, a little information about myself. And then it's more a question of like establishing expertise and for the audience. And that's still difficult. I still don't have a narrative where like half the people who watch my own stuff is like, you don't know what you're talking about, I don't even know what I'm watching you. And then we're like, well then stop watching. And that's why I'm down to just like a handful of viewers, because I wasn't able to really come up with a narrative that made sense to myself and um and the viewers. So like maybe constantly trying to reinvent myself, but like God forbid, I'm an old man, can't really constantly be reinventing myself. So it's
Okay,
kinda,
let me jump in. So I was just reading an essay in the London Review of Books It's a book review by Lauren Berlant, the late Lauren Berlant, on the inconvenience of other people, and talks about the dangers of attaching or getting to know or introducing other people into your life, that it always comes with it frictions and frustrations and inconvenience. So why is it so hard to live with other people? And this is talking about real life interactions. And here's the challenge. Knowing someone and being known by somebody brings a threatened inconvenience. It means the eruption. So an eruption is something that comes out, like a volcano is an eruption. An eruption is when something comes in. So when you are known by somebody, when you bring someone into your life, there's a threatened eruption of someone else comes into your fantasy of having a coherent self, that they can reveal things to you that can blow up your own fantasy of having a coherent self, your own fantasy of a coherent narrative for your life. Is there anything there that you want to comment on?
I think that's the point I was making, that I've accepted that I don't have a coherent self. And maybe before I started streaming, I did think I had a coherent self. And, that's why, I started my research or came up with my multiple truth hypothesis. I'm constantly studying psychology. I mentioned like narrative identity, role identity. And I think that's in line with the best knowledge of experts on the topic, is that, this concept of coherent self does not correspond to reality.
Okay, so let me read to you some notes I made on how live streaming can make you a better man. Frequently it makes people worse, but here are some ways that it can make you better. It can teach you the importance of taking responsibility for your words, because if you say things about people online, it will frequently get back to them. So you either have to stand behind your words or you need to apologize for them. So this accountability that should accompany honorable live streaming is a method of becoming a better man. Any thoughts?
Yeah, I would definitely say like something that was never part of my life, but now I feel competent at like public speaking. I think I could do public speaking now, and I learned that from streaming, and the ability to get the negative feedback that you're unlikely to actually get in real life. Certainly part of streaming could make you a better man. And then also, why I first started streaming was topically that I just wanted to have conversations about the type topics that very rarely can I find a setting or a space of time where a group of people would discuss this topic. But online, I was able to find people interested in the same topic and then have hours and hours of conversation just on the given area of interest.
Okay, great. Go ahead, finish your thought.
Yeah, and then even that also would relate to the negative feedback, because once you're, so like just me and you are talking about Judaism, people are gonna, you're out there and you might get positive feedback, and that works to the negative feedback to like, you don't know what you're talking about, or that's not right. And it doesn't always have to be like egoistic. Sometimes you could gather expertise, like we're just saying, you're just talking about a topic, and then all of a sudden you have the ability to talk to some of the biggest experts in the world on the topic, due to the power of the internet, and due to the fact that most people in real life don't talk about don't get together just to discuss these narrow topics, and that the big experts on the field who specialize in talking about these narrow topics are likely to be much more likely to be willing to join your internet circle, especially if it's dedicated to their narrow topic of expertise.
So I often say that people should normally get most of their meaning and purpose in life from their family, extended family, friends, community, profession, and hobbies. But there are people like me and like you who will just go out of our minds with too extended a conversation on like normal things like food and drink and raising kids, and like the mundane topics that seem to dominate most conversations, I think would drive people like you and me crazy. At least they drive me crazy after a time. I know in Orthodox Judaism that frequently Orthodox Jews can spend hours talking about food and drink, and that just drives me out of my mind. So for me to feel that I have a life filled with meaning, I have to constantly be seeking truth about the wider world. I assume that's the same for you.
Yeah, and I hate repetitive conversations. So even like say most people, like if you're talking like Orthodox Jewish circles, where they're talking about that, not only do they talk about it for hours, but they're actually repetitive conversations. And like if you have Sabbath with the same people over years, in like you say like objectively, we've had basically this exact same conversation 10 times. That's why sometimes I'll pop in the chat on the stream and I'll joke like, is this a repeat? Like if you had like Babs or Brundle on or something, and there's some form of like role identity of comfortability within a conversation where there's a comfortability to just repeat conversations, and maybe the people don't realize they're repeating the conversation, but I think on some level they do, and there's just a comfortability factor in doing that. So I want new information. And I think the other day you were talking about just the heuristic, like you could assume like your mom, your best friend, your worst enemy is watching, and I quit back like, no, my mom has no interest in these topics. And if you're talking about a given topic, your best friend, your family members, just aren't interested. They're not going to watch. Like if you did as like I gave the example like chess playing, and like maybe someone would be like, okay, like you're going to learn how to play chess just for me because it's really important to me, and then maybe you'd become a chess player. But like, don't, I mean, generally you could have a long-term friendship and just be like, oh, he really enjoys this and I've never done it, and so whenever he does it, like I just tune out. It's not interesting to me. And so I think that's also part of streaming. My dad plays internet chess sometimes, and my mom still doesn't even know how to play the game. So I think that's could be normal and healthy in the internet. The internet just is a tool like Chat GPT. It's just a tool that could be positive or negative, and that could be one of the positive aspects of it.
Another possible positive aspect of live streaming is that I find it's the most demanding thing that I typically do. I get more drained from live streaming than almost anything else except for the most intense cognitive labor. But overall, I find live streaming with its multiple cognitive loads, such as checking sound quality, visual quality, preparing topics to discuss, queuing up things to play, interacting with the chat, noticing how the stream is flowing over multiple platforms at once, that it's a real cognitive and emotional workout. Do you find it such an intense workout? How would you place it compared to other tests in your life?
Yeah, definitely. Although I would, what I mentioned, public speaking, and I'm not sure if you ever were able to move into public speaking, but I would assume public speaking is more demanding. And really, it's only happened at like the Hare Krishna temple. But I remember like a few times where I spoke in front of everybody, even just briefly, and they had like the microphone, the sound system. There might have been a pretty big crowd, like 50 to 100 people. And even if it was like open mic or topical, where people were just introducing themselves, and when you speak into the microphone and you hear your voice echoing through the whole hall, and it's loud. So I'm not sure if you have any experience in public speaking, but or if you would agree with me that presumably public speaking is even more demanding.
Yeah, I've had my share of public speaking experience. I've even been the scholar in residence at one synagogue in Los Angeles. Let me go back to my blog post here on ways that live
Do you have
streaming.
a memory of that feel like when you first speak in the microphone?
It's very intense, but I find this is similar to public speaking. So I wouldn't say that public speaking is more demanding than this. I would say it's equally demanding, because this is a form of public speaking. So here's my next point on how live streaming can make you a better man. You get a regular test for prioritizing your own well-being or the well-being of your online production. So do you put the priority on your real self or on your internet self? So the more priority you put on your e-personality, usually the more off track you get in life. So there's a constant stimulus that then immediately spits out feedback about your direction in life. So any thoughts on live streaming as a test for your ability to conduct self-care or to disregard your self-care in your pursuit of a virtual personality?
Yeah, it might be like a caveat of actually having an audience, because like, you know, I mean, thank God you were able to build up a reasonable audience or become somewhat of a public figure, at least an e-figure, where there's maybe even hundreds of thousands of people who know who you are, or hundreds of people who check out almost everything that you say, as opposed to, you know, most people have no audience. Or, you know, maybe TikTok is that way. They get a whole bunch of views, and, you know, you don't know your imaginary friends, like, you know, if they're just part of a TikTok algorithm or random people in China. So I mean, I think you'd have to differentiate to being in front of an actual legitimate audience, and then how did you get that audience to, you know, now you're interacting in front of an audience that I think most people have never necessarily experienced, that they've never interacted in front of an audience. So I don't know if you're making that differentiation to actually having an audience, and then you'd have the narrative factor of, well, how do you have an audience? How did it come to be that you have an audience, and now you're talking about the capacity to interact in front of an audience, as opposed to most people who've never had an audience?
Well, I'm just talking about those who have an audience. So the typical thing that I will produce, considering it's going out on 5 or 6 platforms, like cumulative views combined with podcast, you know, listens. So typical video will have, you know, anywhere from 400 to, you know, 1,000 or more views or listens. So that's an audience. I'm just taking the audience for granted in my point. Let me go on to my next point here.
Till I streamed, or like I never had that. Even now, like, you know, I have a smaller imprint, but you get a few hundred views. And then I remember when I first started streaming, it was really, you know, after I met you, and then you know, I was putting up videos, and some of my videos even got like a few thousand views and some comments, but they weren't streaming. So when you were saying that, you know, it's like your position of privilege to be talking about, like, you know, just the presumed, like, when I talk, like, I have an audience.
Okay. Next point. You, by doing a regular live stream, you have to learn to make peace with making mistakes and not doing as well as you hope. I mean, you're always going to be somewhat frustrated by things that you forgot to say, by things you didn't phrase as eloquently as you wish. I know when I start a show, there are many topics I want to explore, many ideas and things, narratives that I want to develop. But as soon as I press the live stream button to go live, the technical and social demands of the show just eat away at much of my cognitive power. My conversational palette immediately narrows, you know, becomes much more compressed than what I anticipated. I have to lean much more on my notes as the ideas and narratives leave my head. I tend to not write down as many notes as would be optimal. I consistently overestimate my ability to retain ideas in my head without writing things down. So there are so many things to look after with a live show, with sound quality being number one. Paying attention to one aspect of your show takes you away from other things. For example, I always try to write down timestamps on every show, but when I'm doing that, I'm not paying attention to anything else. I'm not paying as much attention to listening. I can't be speaking while I'm writing down timestamps. So one way that doing a live stream can make you a better man is that you have to make peace with your imperfection and the imperfection of creating something like a live stream with its multiple demands. Any thoughts?
Yeah, just as you were saying that, I was remembering when I lived in Manhattan, and I had my, you know, rapper friend roommate, and you know, that was towards the advent, like Facebook just came out during that period, like, and in fact it was even before Facebook came out, and you know, maybe there was MySpace or something, but he would spend an inordinate amount of time practicing his rhymes, and we also had like a big mirror, and like he would spend like hours just staring at himself in the mirror, and sometimes we would both be there, and we would both just kind of like stare at ourselves in front of the mirror, and I was more doing like self-reflection, like, who am I? Although, you know, he was, you know, had rhymes, he was trying to become famous, he was doing pickup artistry, you know, maybe, you know, God forbid, even some drug dealing, and um but he was constantly rehearsing and testing things, and then he would go out and try it. He would go to the clubs, and he would you know, because he was a musician and had rhymes, and he worked at it, he perfected it, and also his pickup artistry game, that he was always working on his pickup artistry game. And you know, so that was before the advent of this technology, and you know, presumably in Hollywood, you know, that's everyone did that. But now the application of this technology may be superior to just practicing in front of a mirror. I don't know if you obviously you're old enough to whether you did it yourself to you practice in front of a mirror. And so even in yeshiva, like as people start becoming rabbis, you got to practice your sermon. And many times, like I've sat there for people when they practice their sermon. And so just when you were saying that, it was making me go back to the old days where people did that kind of things for in front of a mirror.
Yeah, it's a mirror. It's a mirror to your soul. It's a mirror to your mind, in addition to the physical mirror that happens when you live stream. And people notice when you're looking, overweight, when you've lost weight, when you're looking more buff, less buff, when you're looking healthier or sicker. So you're getting immediate feedback. You're often getting the kind of brutal feedback that you don't get from people face to face. Another way that you can grow through live streaming is you have to recognize the reality is most people are better off, without your show, that most people have, more important priorities than your show, and that many people who are once key parts of your show, such as my show, have moved on for very good reasons. So if you accept these realities, it better situates you in reality, and you are much better off in life when you're at ease with reality as opposed to denying reality. So any thoughts on these points?
Yeah, I always stress, Church of Entropy or the value proposition. And, I saw the guy, Ben Thorpe, he's making his rounds. His daughter's getting bigger. She's like, almost co-host on the Kill Stream, and, getting either like someone in the alt-right, but, even different spheres of the internet. And he had this like list of like, supposedly people that were scared to debate him. And, I didn't have a chance to speak with him. I don't even know if he would accept the feedback, but it's saying like, well, those guys are professionally, like the value proposition. Most of those people have moved into the period where this is what they do for a living. And like, you got to pay them. I always stress to people, like, the best way to get people to stream with you is to pay them. And almost no one wanted to do that. It's like most of these people that they do this, they do it for a living. And if you want them to appear in your program, the single best way to get them is just to offer them money. And but any form of the value proposition, the value to you as a streamer, the value to the listeners, the value to the people in the chat, the value to your co-host and the guests, and should always have that in mind. And sometimes people will do it when there's a negative value proposition. And if the value, and maybe that's some kind of like the negative Judaic attitude where you're always thinking like it's in your best interest, like I know what's best for you, Goy, type value propositioning. Yeah, I don't know if you think in terms of like value proposition like that, or if you think there's a Judaic characteristic to thinking in terms of value proposition.
Well, I do think in terms of value proposition, that's recognizing that checking out a live stream is not in most people's best interest, that they should have other priorities aside from one's own production. Haven't thought about the Jewish dimension to that. Let me move on to my
Or just push back when you're saying like, well, I mean, God forbid, like we got bad programming. It's not there. But it's saying that if the programming we were making was in their best interest to watch, then they would watch. So that's like the self-improvement level. So like, why is our viewership down? Because the value proposition has shifted, and were we able to come up with a way to move the value proposition back in favor of the viewer, that would be how you would gain viewership. And saying like, that's how I came onto your program. The value proposition was there. I wanted to hear from these people then on the alt-right, and I wanted to hear them talking to a Jew, and you were the one putting that together, and that's how I ended up in your audience, because the value proposition was there. And like it is show business, so it could be impossible to always have the value proposition in your favor.
Well, also it's the value proposition for whom. So if I do a show that requires a minimum IQ of 120 to benefit from or to enjoy, that's a much smaller potential audience. That's about 5% of the potential audience, as opposed to doing a show where you only need a minimum IQ of 100 to enjoy. But there is also a good incentive for personal growth through live streaming here, in that, do you put the interests of the viewer at the forefront of your head? So is it just that I want to get something off my chest, or do I take the time to empathize with what the viewer wants? And I may want to produce a show that has a minimum IQ of 120 to be able to access it. But even then, I can do a show that displays considerable empathy for the viewer, even the high IQ viewer, or I can do a show that demonstrates, no empathy for the viewer. It's just simply what I want to get off my chest. Anything you want to comment on?
Yeah, I mean, you do a lot of things to make it more easy for the viewer. Like, I mean, you timestamp a table of contents, although you don't necessarily predate your programs and tell people, like what to expect, or something. I mean, you put a title in, although it's not necessarily always what you're talking about, but you do considerable amount of effort to make it easier for the viewer. And I think the general model for live streaming as a business model, and maybe you are successful for a small period of time, and I call it like the destiny model of live streaming, is you get on a big platform, you get enough people from that big platform over to your platform, and then you just review other people's content and count the super chats. And when you were in Warski, that was probably what you were somewhat capable of doing. Like, once you appeared there, you had a lot of people who knew who you are, tuned into your channel, and then you could kind of just review other people's content. And I call it, like the destiny model, because he's one of the few streamers out there where just getting on his program could put you in an opportunity where you have a few hundred people watching. And then what are you going to do for those few hundred people? You're just going to review what they pay you to review and count the super chats, hopefully. And if you take off, you continue. And if your audience dwindles, I don't know if you agree that that's kind of the generic streamer model right now, of getting on a bigger platform, getting those people to migrate to you, and then just reviewing content.
Right. That's a business model that's effective, and it's also a model that's reasonably effective to get views. But intellectual work almost never pays for itself. And so if you're going to produce intellectual content, it would be unrealistic to ever expect that it will pay for itself. It's just not going to happen. So I decided to primarily produce intellectual content on my live stream, so I don't expect them to pay for themselves. And I don't use like a Destiny model or a Nick Fuentes model or any of these other models for people who are just, pouring out moronic content.
Yeah, and then almost the benevolence goes, like, if you're so smart that you could produce intellectual content, you're probably so smart to realize that, like, it's not a good way to make money. And then kind of like, well, like, you're rich, right? Like, you're an old man and you're intellectual, so you're probably rich. You're not doing this to make money. And which is somewhat of a reasonable presumption to so a lot of the streamers, like, if you're a professor, that's why a lot of the guys, like, you just got to pay them because they're professors and they need the money, and you want them to appear on your channel. You got to pay them. Or a lot, God forbid, most intellectuals never actually financially became wealthy. Some of them upper middle class, and they make their money by getting paid to appear on shows. Like, I don't even, someone like Paul Gottfried or something. I don't know. I think we discussed, I don't know if you ever paid guest or something like that.
I've
But
almost never paid a guest. So professors almost never get paid. They are paid by the state or private institutions financing their professorships, right? They very rarely get paid for appearing on a live stream.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think live stream would be the type thing, but I mean, I don't know, like Paul Gottfried or something like that. If he would be an example, maybe he would be the type guy who, if you paid him, he would appear on your show. And he might, like, I mean, there are a lot of small time intellectuals, and even the super chat model of, but saying the people are trying to make money at it. But then it's, the paradox of, like the chess player's paradox, like, oh, you're so smart, how come you're broke? And like, you're smart
Well,
enough to be the greatest.
there's no paradox there. Intellectual life does not pay for itself. That's something that's just 99.99% true. Those who are intellectuals and they found a way to make money, it's usually because they are running some kind of con scheme where they are pretending to present, profundity that they're not really doing.
Yeah, but the Andrew Tate model, where I thought I was following him, and I think the one thing that I've speculated that very few people have backed up is that he is not actually that rich, and that maybe at most he's a small time millionaire, and he may not even have that much money at all. but for his business model, he portrays it like he's extremely wealthy and he's just doing this because he wants to give back and share the information. Well, meanwhile, actually he's doing it because that's the main source of his money. But that level of intellectual content, like if you're saying like I'm doing this to give back, I'm doing it to share some of my research, versus the alternative motivation, like you're doing it for gain, and then it turns into credibility. I mean, I think it's a reasonable thing to ask him. You just kind of, I mean, you gave a reasonable answer. I don't necessarily disagree with it, but I think
No,
the
I
question,
don't. Yeah, I don't
if you're
accept
so
either.
smart, if you're so smart, how come you're not rich, is actually a very reasonable question to ask.
Yeah, I don't think it is, because intellectual life does not pay for itself. That's just a fact of life. And so I don't do live streams primarily to create credibility for myself, or if I got the other alternative, I do it because this is who I am. This is what I enjoy. So for me, this is primarily a hobby. I'm doing something I enjoy, equivalent to those who paint because they like to paint, or those who garden who like to garden.
Well, if your credibility, and okay, you have a little. I mean, you're an author. You have some accomplishments. You're a known man in some level of Hollywood. But you said that your credibility is established outside of streaming, and then there are people who want to know about you, and you're making yourself available or to put off a certain message through streaming, as opposed to um, your credibility needing to be established within the venue of streaming. And both are possible. And maybe when you're as a blogger or streamer, you're saying your credibility is established through your real life, and then the streaming is just the way you make yourself publicly available, as opposed to actually trying to establish credibility through
No, I
streaming.
didn't say anything like that. I said I live stream because it's something I enjoy, and that was my point. But anyway, you made your point there repeatedly. So let me move on to another way
Not
that.
meant a generic you also. When I said you, I didn't. I meant like a generic you, like anybody who was streaming, not necessarily you.
Right, good point. So another way that you can become a better man through live streaming is you can learn to stand on your own 2 feet and not need audience approval. So often on these live streams, I will say things that every single person in the chat will strongly disagree with. And you also constantly having to face choices of risking and possibly losing relationships for the sake of saying what you believe to be true. This is a good test in life. You can always cuck to save your relationships, or you can make the other mistake and just heedlessly burn your relationships, or you can try to steer a middle path, valuing both your relationships and the pursuit of truth, and make considered, careful, individual choices. So learning to stand on your own 2 feet is one of the possible benefits to gain from live streaming, avoiding audience capture and staying in integrity with what you believe to be true. Any thoughts on this, Dooovid?
Yeah, I agree. Although it goes back to what I was just saying before, that it's from a point of privilege where you actually have an audience. Because most people, if they stream, no one's going to listen to them. And to the point where I have an audience, and even if I don't cater to my audience, I still have an audience, which is a state of privilege. And it's like the generic you as a person who has credibility outside and makes themselves publicly available. And you're saying, well, I want to make myself publicly available to do what I want, not what the audience wants. And the audience, just in appreciation of me making myself publicly available, will tune in for what I want as opposed to what they want. So you have to know your power level. It takes a certain power level to be able to do that. And you could test your power level, because if your power level's not there, your audience will abandon you.
Okay, I'm going to move on. Any final words for today, David?
Yeah, just before you messaged me, I was reading that tablet article on like the history of the alt-right. And if you wanted to set aside a stream, it was a pretty long article, and I was disappointed because it didn't mention like the prominent role that like right-wing Jews, Hasidic Jews, and Orthodox Jews played in it, and it had kind of like the anti-Semitism or the racism level. But if you did look at that tablet roll and wanted to go through like I mean, either a memory lane or a intellectual analysis of what that article got wrong by ignoring the role that Jews played in the formation of the alt-right, I've found that interesting.
Okay, great. To be continued. Thanks, David.
Yeah, have a great day. Thanks a lot.
Take care. Okay, let me go to Robert Wright here, talking with Mickey Kaus about the special prosecutor appointed in the Joe Biden, Hunter Biden story.
Impeachable, but
Well, the key with impeachment, it doesn't have to be a crime.
well, neither is not voting. The reason to not vote for someone.
Right.
So anyway, okay, so
And
maybe
that's heating up incredibly quickly. And you have like there should be some word for like the Peggy Noonan is sort of has now pronounced it's a real scandal. Okay, you need like 2 or 3 more figures. I was arguing with somebody who was trying to figure out why did people take Watergate so seriously. I mean, it obsessed the nation for months.
Mhm.
It eventually led to Nixon's impeachment. It was not as corrupt as this. Okay, as this potentially is, and nobody cares about this, but they cared intensely about Nixon. And why was it? I think it's because the press had more credibility. People who they trusted to be neutral said this is a real scandal. Nixon lied, but Biden's lied. I don't understand it. So if 4 or 5, 2 or 3 more, 4 or 5 more people like Peggy Noonan say, like Bob Woodward comes out and says, sorry, this is really bad. This is a real scandal.
yeah,
And
but
2 or 3 other people, I think maybe it will be a scandal.
yeah, but I think the jump from there's a big wall between Peggy Noonan and Bob Woodward. Peggy Noonan is a Wall Street Journal columnist. There's a whole bunch of Wall Street Journal columnists who
Let me fast forward here to some other points on the Hunter Biden scandal.
Turn against us. Remember when Colonel Vindman, in the impeachment hearing of Trump, he originally was horribly upset by Trump's phone call trying to bully Zelensky into investigating Burisma and Hunter.
The
Not
perfect
because
call?
the perfect call. Not because he thought that there was a bogus investigation and that Hunter and Burisma weren't guilty, but because it would piss off the Democrats and jeopardize bipartisan support for Ukraine.
Right.
So this is the same deal. This is of a piece with that. So they may have thought that somehow Biden's revenge power outlasted his office, even though he was out of office. The only thing I can think of.
So yeah, go ahead.
We could broaden this. You could broaden the scandal to Obama.
How can we do that?
I don't know, but there's been a lot of talk about Obama because of this David Samuels interview with David Garrow in
Who's David
Tablet
Garrow?
magazine. The biographer of Martin Luther King, who wrote a very, very nasty biography of Obama that didn't get any traction, including his letters to his girlfriend where he mused about having sex with men.
Yeah.
How could that not have any gossip value? Good grief. Why did I only hear about that yesterday? And he makes the interesting point that, which I hadn't realized, I had thought Obama, after he left office, had gone to Hollywood. He'd spend all his time scouting homes in Palm Springs and, selling TV shows to Microsoft and Apple and, and living the life of Hollywood and raking it in. No, he stayed in Washington. He had a house in Washington. And we never hear stories about what he did in Washington. Okay. And Garrow's theory is he was running the fucking government from his townhouse, from his house in Calorama. He was doing something.
Wait a second. Wait, what years is this?
This is the Biden presidency, the last 4 years, 3 years.
I fear I wish Obama were that engaged. Maybe he'd ease Joe out of contention for the presidency and give us a replacement.
Anyway, so the crazy extension would be that somehow pissing off Joe would also piss off Obama, and Obama really was still a power to be reckoned with. So Ukraine couldn't afford to piss off Obama. So they give money to Hunter.
That seems pretty strained.
Yeah.
Now,
Okay, so go ahead.
So the interview was by David Samuels?
Of Garrow.
I think
really
I
has
have great doubts about Samuels, but that's another story since he's
I
not
have
the one
great doubts
doing the
about
testifying.
both of them.
Yeah.
It was because of that, it was a very interesting issue.
Okay, another clip here from this discussion.
The general
Wright Mickey
assessment of
Kaus.
Obama's legacy has certainly soured a bit. It was very high when people were saying, God, I wish for the days of Obama instead of Trump. They were so calm. I do think Obamacare was a big step forward. I think he gets credit for that, defective as it was. Even if it didn't improve the health of Americans, it lowered the anxiety level of Americans. So more people think they can get insurance. It completely screwed over independent freelance workers, but who cares about them? And they're fixing that supposedly. There are alarming signs. I had my first doctor who completely left Medicare, and he's on his own. I have to pay him $350 a visit. That's for starters, and none of it is covered by insurance, not even by my Medigap. So it's strictly out of my pocket. Okay, if 4 more doctors do that, Medicare is worthless to me, right? So, or I have to.
Okay, I just read a great analysis of Barack Obama and Oprah Winfrey. And this is from the late Lauren Berlant, who was a scholar of affect, meaning of emotion. And she had this read of Obama and Oprah. She says, Oprah's sentimentality always abjures the political, means pushes aside the political. It always sees change as coming from within. It always sees obstacles to change as internal wounds and not structural blockages in the political and wider economic context. Similarly, Obama wanted to believe that through him, we could dissolve in our emotions what's antagonistic in wider political and economic structures, in social structures, so that the long history of American racism could be dissolved, because he will stimulate in us, emotions that will overcome American racism. And then, because Obama has healed us emotionally, he'll bring politics to make structural what has been achieved first in our feelings. So both Oprah and Obama are classic sentimentalists who view individual feeling as the crucible for political change. And without considering their appeal to our emotions, to our sentiments, we cannot account for their popular appeal, nor for their limitations. I thought that was great analysis. So in 2016, Lauren Berlant showed Obama's Yes We Can advertisements to undergraduates who were too young to have followed the 2008 presidential campaign. And how did her undergraduates react? They began to cry. Right? Until that moment, she says her students did not know that they had national sentimentality. And the author of this piece says, I once took my English boyfriend to a minor league baseball game and he whirled up at the Star-Spangled Banner. That is the power of American affect or American national emotions for you. The author says, I laughed at him, but Lauren Berlant was generous enough to watch the students cry over Barack Obama and his message of yes, we can, and conclude that the world is just not a very safe space for people's tender sentiments. And this tenderness means that we would like the world to be different, and we don't want to experience more loss on the way to this different world. So that analysis struck me as brilliant. So you may wonder, who is Lauren Berlant and who is the author of this book review piece? Erin Maglaque is her name, the author. And I've got a brief little video of her here. She is a professor of English.
I have a long-standing interest in gender history, and so it sort of fits into that kind of wider trajectory.
It's interesting. She kind of speaks with is this a Valley Girl affect? Is this a Valley Girl accent? How would you describe this American accent? She is a professor at the University of Sheffield in Northern England.
My first book, I was really interested in gender in the early modern Venetian Empire and this kind of
So she seems to have very much of kind of a girl affect in her voice and manner. It's very girly here. It's kind of not very scholarly.
Professional, multi-ethnic Mediterranean world. And I was looking at the patrician men who were kind of colonial governors, and then married women who were actually their own subjects.
And her voice seems swallowed in the back of her throat. There isn't a lot of musicality to the voice. It seems very monotone.
Who were perhaps Greek Orthodox, and these kind of, these mixed marriages. But when I finished that book, I really wanted to move beyond the kind of patrician and to look at the experiences of ordinary women, and particularly experiences of kind of ordinary motherhood. The patrician is obviously fascinating, and the sources are kind of incredible for that kind of group of people. But I wanted a bit more of a challenge, and I wanted to kind of get at these experiences of ordinary women. And I think also it was a personal preoccupation. I had a baby and now have a toddler, and so the very delicate balance between paid work and care work is very much on my mind in a kind of personal capacity too. And then I guess the kind of last thing that sort of drew me in this direction is I really felt like within early modern history more broadly, the kind of ongoing debates about women's work, I think, are kind of one of the most vibrant areas of the field. There's these sort of huge projects on early modern England and Sweden, and a lot of scholarship on Italy too. And it just felt like such a kind of vibrant and interesting area to be working, where there were really kind of current debates about methodology, about the gender division of labor, about this kind of relationship between paid and unpaid work, which I find so fascinating. And so I think all of those kind of things together drew me into this world of sort of how ordinary women navigated this like really difficult boundary, I think, between undertaking paid work for the market and reproductive labor.
So why do some people keep ending their sentences in yeah? So according to the chat, it's not Valley Girl speech. This is East Coast liberal arts speak. That's what Elliot Blatt says. But why do so many people, like this female professor, end their sentences in yeah? So most British people, according to Quora, Quora, most British people don't say yeah at the end of a sentence. It would be most prevalent in certain dialects in southeastern England. So this is an English dialect affectation. It's unusual to hear combined with an American accent. So it's used as an affirmation that the sentence ends. So I think it's better to end your sentences with yeah rather than just plow on, as many people do, without really checking in that you're, following along. So it's used as an affirmation that the sentence has ended, or the series of sentences that precedes its use, right? The making of a statement, it's to confirm that the listener understands what has been said. It's often used as a question requiring a response from the listener. That was a great match. Yeah. So other dialects use other forms in a similar way. So some people say or eh. So it means, do you understand? So different dialects around the British Isles use different words for the same linguistic purpose. So ending your sentence in yeah is not all that common, particularly unusual to see it coming from an American accent. Okay, here is the title story: Arrest warrants issued after boaters attack Alabama dock employee. Let me rewind.
Police in Montgomery, Alabama have issued 4 arrest warrants after this viral brawl. Videos captured the moment several people attacked a black dock worker over the weekend.
ABC's Steve Osunsami has more on the fight and who came to that worker's rescue.
The fight that broke out here in Montgomery, Alabama is being celebrated all over the internet for the way police responded and for the way that black eyewitnesses came to this dock worker's rescue.
Those guys who parked there were told not to leave it there, and they left it there.
Witnesses say it started when this crew member in the white uniform tried moving a boat that the owners had parked in this spot. He was trying to make room for a riverboat that was on the way in. That's when a shirtless man came to confront the dock worker, and then his friends came out, and then one of them got violent, beating the crew member. In seconds, there were several people outnumbering him, and this woman even seen kicking him while he was down.
When the first punches were thrown, you just felt so helpless for that man. Like, there's 5 or 6 of them on him.
But all of a sudden, black eyewitnesses who were watching decided it was time to help the man who was being beaten, running, even swimming up to the scene, beating back on the people who attacked the man. Police came in minutes and, according to Montgomery's mayor, detained several reckless individuals for attacking a man who was doing his job.
Police say they have 4 active warrants out so far, and there could be more once they get a better look at.
So this looks to me like 5 white people wrongfully attacking a black man who's just doing his job.
This video. And they say that the fighting, and they mean everyone who was fighting, was intolerable. Steve Osunsami, ABC News.
Okay, so let's get a discussion here from Gavin McGinnis and Anthony Cumia.
To this fight, this kind of whites versus black fight that happened in Alabama?
Yes,
maybe
I
over the
have.
weekend?
It's the most important fight of 2023.
Oh, it's like they will talk about this in 100 years as they talk about Black Wall Street, or
exactly.
This is what it'll be,
and it's the opposite of what they say.
Yes, it is.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. So I've kind of noticed on social media that black people are really taking this as a huge W. And
yes.
They've been getting tattoos and talking about this and that, and training their kids on how to smash people with a chair. Anyway, I was hoping I could just get you guys to comment on that and
absolutely
and kind of see what your perspective is.
Yeah, we were definitely going to talk about that. It was in the preparation. But the chair thing is great because if you remember maybe a year or so ago, there was a fight at a Waffle House or one of those fucking places, and this white chick grabbed a chair. Had a chair thrown at her, and she did this ninja move, and
airbender.
And it was pretty much the same vibe. Everyone was like, cool. Like, whitey ain't taking their shit anymore. This white chick decided they're going to fight back. They're going to throw shit back, say, fuck you, come on, bring it on. And it was like this moment of white people going, yeah, we're fighting back. And this episode, black people treat it like it's something that never happens. Oh, it happens. Take the video. Here's what you got to do. Take the video of what happened in Alabama. Run it through a filter where you put the negative on, where now white is black and black is white. Now you'll see everything that happens ever on at the beginning anyway.
But you sound like you're saying that black people are right. It was an example of whites being out of line. The very beginning.
I do believe that from what I know about this incident, that those 5 white people who attacked a black man for doing his job, that the 5 white people were in the wrong and the black man was simply doing his job. Right, that boat that he was untying was parked in a place where it had no permission to park, right? Where there were signs up saying, do not park here. This is for the riverboat.
Was 2 guys. There wasn't a security guard. He worked at the riverboat. He like hitched a ride to get over to the shore.
Yeah.
He unmoored their boat.
Yeah,
which he should not be doing.
I think that's
the boat was parked illegally, occupying space that belonged to the riverboat.
Piracy. I think he could be arrested for.
No, that wasn't piracy. That was a boat that was parked illegally in a space for the riverboat.
R-N. Don't say R. N, matey. N
with a hard R.
With a hard R.
So then they get mad about the unmooring, and they punch both him and another white security
guard
side.
Right.
So that you could argue that was like white on black racism, whatever you fucking want. I don't care.
Yeah.
And then after that initial 15 seconds.
Most amazing part, by the way, a black man swimming.
I said on my show, I was like, a black man swimming is like a white man flying. But then after that, it was a complete fucking melee.
Yeah.
And it was unjustified, the melee.
Of course.
And the chair thing, don't be proud of the chair. That was random black people smashing a woman on the head with a folding chair.
Yeah, with a folding chair.
Yeah. So after I with the blacks who went to support the black worker who was just doing his job and to try to protect him, but then when it turned into a melee where they just started smashing random people, then obviously that's wrong.
It had nothing to do with anything.
They just want to see white people getting hurt and beat up by black people. Right. It's pretty much it. And the majority of videos you see available are black people assaulting white people or Asian people especially. So when they get a video where you could show something like this, where they can almost justify it, that it was some racial white on black thing that they came in and helped. Yeah, they came in.
I do think that initially that there probably was, did just my eyes indicated it was a white on black thing for poor reasons initially.
And kept a lynching from happening.
Right.
Like, no, it's just, again, another group of blacks.
And again, at this point, all racial bets are off, and blacks are just like little baby Al Capones are mobbing random white people for no reason. So I don't get how you see this as a W. You look terrible.
Look terrible, but to them it's awesome. And I'll tell you another thing: when black people get upset that white people paint them with a wide brush, they go, "Oh, how come if stores are getting robbed by black people, you follow me around the store? We're individuals. Don't tell me because black people are shoplifting more that because I walked into your store, you have to be on the lookout. I am an individual. Don't equate me with the rest of black." Well, then you're jumping in.
Why'd you literally jump in the water?
Just because
swim over there.
The guy was black. Well, they would never.
Because generally speaking, black Americans have stronger in-group identity than white Americans. Right? That's it.
Have gone over there if it was just 2 white guys getting beat up by other white guys.
There's this incredible tribalism with Black Americans and with the left.
And I give him credit for that, by the way.
And Horatio says in the chat, there's zero evidence that White attacked the black guy for being black. They probably would have attacked a white guy. They told the white boat owner to F off. Good point.
White people should have
I wish we had some tribalism. But when you see, like, in New Rochelle, where Ryan's gym is, there was this homeless man who was shot to death, and he was reaching for a cop's gun.
Oh, yeah. I heard about
the community got out, big parade, and I could tell, because Ryan went and interviewed them, I could tell they don't give a fuck about the details. It's like a blood murdered a Crip. Now, that Crip could have murdered that blood's entire...
Yeah, that's just the nature of in-group identity, right? The stronger your in-group identity, the more automatically you'll go to the rescue of your in-group against an out-group when there is a contest.
Family.
Right.
It doesn't matter.
It doesn't matter.
One of your guys hurt one of my guys.
It's a gang mentality,
It's gang mentality. I don't give a fuck about the circumstances. And whites are constantly obsessed with the circumstances.
Yep.
To a fault, like they overdo it. They have that whole To Kill a Mockingbird thing.
Oh, they'll go out of their way to try and dispel any theory that maybe the black person was responsible.
Right.
Well, maybe it was this or that. And then when push comes to shove, if they can't find anything...
yeah, ties bind and blind. The stronger your in-group identity, that's exactly how you're going to react, whether you're white or black or Jewish or gay or Muslim. So I've started following the Women's World Cup of soccer because the Australian team is doing so well, and more Australians are watching the Matildas, the name of the national Australian female soccer team. More Australians are watching them play live than all other sporting events in Australia. So it's an opportunity to share a collective attention and consciousness and energy with millions of my fellow Australians. So because I feel an in-group identity as an Australian, in addition to an in-group identity as an American, in addition to an in-group identity as a Los Angelino and a Dallas Cowboy fan and an Orthodox Jew, all right, I've got a lot of in-group identities, but I'm paying a little bit of attention to women's soccer, even though the quality of women's soccer is below that of a good 14-year-old boys high school team. I'm paying some attention because it's a way for me to join in with my in-group. It's not because the quality of women's soccer is so sterling. So I just learned about Lauren Berlant, right? I didn't know that there were professors of affect, right? Affect is a fancy academic term for feeling. So she died in 2021. Let me just play a little bit more from her.
One of the kind of doxic moment in my work is to say that public spheres are affect worlds. That is, we're attached to the world and the worlds that present themselves to us and the worlds we imagine. And we don't intend those affective attachments, but we discover those affective attachments. You're born with zero attachments, and then in order to flourish, in order to stay alive, you actually have to have them. And so you can't really be against optimism. You can't be against attachment because you...
So she's talking here about her book on optimism, but it has a fascinating title. It's about the downsides or the price paid for optimism. It's called cruel optimism. And she just makes some great points here in just a few words, that you can't live without attachments. If you don't learn to attach to people, you'll attach to substances like drugs or alcohol or food, or to processes such as gambling addiction, sex addiction, porn addiction. Right? You can't live without attachment, but as soon as you form attachments, particularly with people, they can blow up your sense of having a coherent narrative for your life.
Living requires you actually to be attached to something. So then what's interesting is what's the relation between the form of an attachment and the affects that get magnetized to that attachment, and the history and situation of that magnetization of affect is the political and is the social. Okay, so I'm interested in how feelings bind us not only to the people we know but the people we don't know, and how even being bound to people we don't know, including, and not just people we don't know, but things we don't know, and ideas we don't know, and smells we don't know. The essay says you could be bound to anything: smells, ideas, humans. It doesn't really matter. That form of binding is itself the condition of your flourishing. Therefore, it's not only content but it's form. And then the question is, how do you make a better world for the attachment to life that you have, right? So the thing I'm really interested in are the affects of belonging, the relation between attachment to the world and the feeling of belonging to the world. And what is the relationship between the feeling, does belonging always feel like belonging, or does it sometimes feel like prison? And does it sometimes feel suffocating, and does it sometimes feel impossible? And does belonging feel like foreclosure when it's also the condition of your actual flourishing in the world? Those kinds of questions are really central. And the thing that I want to get to, I'm going to be writing the book after next, is sort of going to be is going to be about the affects of belonging, particularly the affects of the commons. I mean, do we even know what the affects of a collective belonging would be? And how do people even think? The commons is now being kind of touted as the way to think about democracy without hierarchy, or the collection of singularities. But you could say it as form. But what?
Okay, this is Lauren Berlant, professor of affect, meaning public emotions. She is speaking here back in 2011.
What's the affect of it, and how would you know it when you felt it, if you felt it? And so I'm interested, therefore, when Anne was reading, nobody ever willingly abandons a libidinal position, which is one of my favorite phrases for some reason.
I mean, think of everything that's in that phrase. Nobody willingly abandons a libidinal position, right? The power of the libidinal, of the lustful, of sex, right, just tends to overwhelm every other consideration.
Because it's true, I mean, but also because it's beautiful. I always make a mistake when I say it, which is nobody ever willingly abandons a political position, because the political and libidinal are all tied up with each other, because people understand at some...
Yeah, the political and the libidinal, all right, the political and the lustful are tied up with each other in that they give meaning and coherence and a narrative to our life. It's how we understand ourselves and whether we're winning or losing at life.
Level that their attachment to the political is their attachment to being in the commons, to being attached to being in a collective world. And what's the relation between being attached to the political and being attached to politics? Politics, the place where you're always disappointed, and the political, the place where you're always excited. And so it's kind of...
So her book is Cruel Optimism, that we need things to believe in, and we need these things that we believe in. They shape our narrative, our sense of self. They give us meaning and purpose in life, yet they will always disappoint us.
Like what Tavi was saying about the good, bad object of technology. On the one hand, it's the thing that it wears out and it becomes broken. And on the other hand, the idea of it is actually something that lights your brain up, And one of the things you could always think about is how optimism and trauma do the same kind of thing. It lights up a part of your brain that makes you non-sovereign. And so the thing that really interests me is the ways that people desire and...
Right, so when you're attached to something, to someone, to a process or a substance, right, you lose your sovereignty. Right, when we bring people into our life, when I have guests on the show, I have to surrender a great deal of my sovereignty. When I bring people into my life, when I interact with people, I am giving up a substantial amount of sovereignty. I mean, life is impossible without this, and yet it requires vulnerability, and it requires that these people or processes or substances that we're bringing into our life can absolutely blow up any sense of coherence or meaningful narrative that we have fantasized we've got going on in our life.
Don't desire to become non-sovereign. People desire and don't desire to become attached in a way that makes them lose control. And that those forms of losing control are the forms of belonging to the social. Because I want to actually be involved with people I don't know in order to build a world that I can't see yet. That's the political. That's my attachment to the political, right? So, I mean, I'm saying right like you know me, but that is my attachment. It's your attachment to the political, too, is my point, because that's what the political holds out. It holds out the possibility of a good non-sovereignty. And yet the discourse that we have about what you get when you have democracy is more sovereignty. And yet belonging is all about the possibility of having a world that you could...
So you may get a great deal of meaning in your life from your political attachments. And so then you frequently will experience the agony of defeat. You may get a great deal of meaning in life from your attachment to the Dallas Cowboys. And the Dallas Cowboys haven't even been in an NFC championship game for 28 years, right? There's a great deal of pain with being a fan. And what is nationalism but a form of non-rational fandom? You're a fan of a particular people, right? So the more intense your fandom, the more intense your cruel attachments here, the fantasized optimism that sustains our life, right? The more you get outside of the rational, strategic, autonomous, buffered, distant self as envisioned by the Enlightenment, as envisioned as the highest form of being by moderns, by the liberal left intelligentsia, right? So fandom is a callback to more traditional ways of being, more traditional ways of experiencing the world with your body, where you have immediate primal responses to blood and soil, to family, to your hero system, for example, that marriage is a heterosexual institution, or military should be a heterosexual institution, or that Jesus died for your sins, whatever your hero system. The more traditional your way of experiencing life, the more you come from just these primal responses, as opposed to the attenuated, the disciplined, the distant, the reflexive, the buffered, the strategic, autonomous, rational sense of self that is promoted as the highest sense of self by the liberal left intelligentsia.
Trust with your non-sovereignty, with your dependence on other people, and with the way that you have to be in the world with them to build a life. So it was interesting to me that today's speakers were all about this. And by the way, I have a blog entry kind of percolating, they take me a really long time, called I Prefer To, which is like my answer to Bartleby, the I prefer not to. Like all the philosophers in the world are really into preferring not to. And I'm into preferring, And I think queer theory is into preferring, like would there be a world that would deserve our preferring of it? That's what you want when you try to do politics, is to make a world you could actually desire, since you already have the desire for a world. And so it's also very interesting then to think, what do we do for a living? What do critics do? What's the point of producing new forms for extending our optimism? Because being an
right, so think about being a fan of this show, right? You have all sorts of expectations for the show that probably more often than not I dash. There's all sorts of content that I have produced more often in the past that is compelling, that is visceral, that is immediately grabs you and transports you, contains considerable elements of spectacle. And so you may well come to this show, hoping for it to regain the glories of the past, and yet be continually disappointed.
Intellectuals being optimistic, an idea impacted us, and then we became different, and then we had ideas that we hoped would impact people, and then they would become different. What is it that we're doing when we write, or when we talk, or when we teach a class, or when we're trying to actually get everyone in sync for the possibility of a transformation? Which is Stanley Cavell's definition of love, is the attempt to stay in sync with another. So I'm not saying I love you, but I'm trying to stay in sync with you. But that's people get excited about that when it's just.
Right. So a great theory of human relations is that it revolves around bids. Other people are making a bid for our attention, and usually if someone bids for our attention twice and we either actively decline it or ignore it, people rarely bid a third and fourth or a fifth time. So people are in sync. People who have positive relations with other people, they're in sync with other people's bids, and they're responding.
Just two people, but I'm excited about it when it's the possibility of a world being in sync. And then the possibility that the form of being in sync could open up a space where we could say it and take it back, where we could be genuinely experimental in our trying to imagine what a new good life is. So what everybody was saying today, which is really true about cruel optimism, is that one of the things is about the relationship between survival and flourishing. And that incredibly moving line in the song from Company that Anne cited, to help us survive being alone. Is that it?
To help us survive being alive.
So help us survive being alive. And
so the best way to help you survive being alive is to have good relations with your friends and family and community, right? To have the best possible relations with everyone in your life.
And one of the things I always say in my work, Female Complaint says it really explicitly in the Showboat chapter, in its chapter on musicals, is that what happens all the time in the political is that the difference between 0 and 1, between not surviving and surviving, starts to foreclose all of our imagination for living, because survival is not a given for almost anybody. And so, but it's really important to hold the space open beyond survival, the space of flourishing. And that's what Jose is also trying to think about. It's like, in fact, one of the things we do when we're trying to create a critical space is a space where it would be possible to survive and better, and where survival would be the minima. And then the debate over what politics should do is the debate over the minima. What should the minima be that would constitute life, so that we could imagine what flourishing would be, and that flourishing is what the good life is. And what
So you don't notice trads or conservatives or right-wing or reactionary people talking much about human flourishing, right? So on the left, there's much more of an ethos of follow your bliss. And on the right, there's much more of an ethos of do your duty. So for people on the right, meaning is something that exists outside of yourself, most likely in the form of your community, your tribe, or your nation. And to the extent that you live up to this external framework for meaning, that's the extent to which you will have meaning and that you will flourish, even though people on the right don't really talk much about human flourishing. But people on the left, meaning is something that we create in our own brains. Okay, generally speaking, this is a more liberal individualist perspective, that we can create meaning in our own minds, aside from what the community and the tribe and the nation believes constitutes meaning. This is the buffered identity. Buffered meaning that you are protected from the outside world, that you can just create meaning on your own. The right-wing perspective is that we lead porous identities, that what's going on outside of us has a profound effect on us. It has a more profound effect than anything, generally speaking, that our rational minds can conceive. So on the right, we see meaning as something that exists outside of ourselves that we conform to. On the left, we pursue our bliss, construct meaning, inside our own buffered, reflexive, autonomous, strategic, rational identity.
One of the things cruel optimism is coming out at a moment where there is no escapology possible, in a certain sense, because what there is the aspiration for a present that we could live in. It's not, we can't presume the present.
And this talk was delivered in 2011.
And hope for a future. We can't even presume the present. So we're hoping for a present that we could live in and we could flourish in. And what's hard is that so many of the infrastructures of continuity that have generated the good life since the 1940s in the United States and in social democracies all over the world have collapsed.
Right. So a right-wing perspective on this would blame it on civil rights legislation, which has made our attachment to the traditional constitution attenuated, which has diminished our right to private property, has diminished our right to freedom of association, so has hacked away at the traditional ties that sustain people and enable human flourishing, right? Having more freedom of association, more freedom with your private property so that you can create the kind of life you want with the people that you want to be close to. But those like Lauren Berlant, who's on the left, they blame the lack of human flourishing on inadequate social welfare spending.
So that it's incredibly hard to imagine, and we no longer have an anchor for what we project out as the good life. So this is an opportunity for us as critics and thinkers and artists, is to think, well, what do we want the good life to be collectively? Is it possible? What is it? Is it just not surviving? Is it just the possibility of survival that would be the good life? Or can we imagine something that we would be willing to have, that we would be willing to fight for, and importantly, that we would be willing to lose for? Because the reorganization of life, as cruel optimism says, the reorganization of life requires you to lose your object and to be in the space beyond your object where you can actually encounter other humans and build a world with them. And it means no longer having the archaic fantasy of the good life that you grew up with or that organized the world for you, but actually kind of think, well, that good life didn't really work too well for too many people, and it turned out that like only 6 people could get it. And everybody else, what they were floating on was the fantasy. It was a phantasmatic cushion. And now the phantasmatic cushion has lost its air, or choose your metaphor. And nonetheless, we need the possibility of an imaginary for what to build toward, that we have to be willing to lose for. We have to be willing to disagree with each other, and we have to be willing to experiment and be wrong. And there has to be a space where we can actually be open to the possibility of our non-sovereignty in relation even to our fantasies. So I think, what all of these...
Yeah, that's a profound point, all right, to bring people into your life, all right, and to have positive interactions with them requires the surrender of a substantial amount of your own individual sovereignty. Being part of a community requires surrendering a significant part of your sovereignty, and yet the good life for most people requires these very sacrifices. These are necessary losses.
These papers were about it's the question of what it means to be undone by your fantasy, and then also those moments at which you have to
Right. Think about successful sexual act. All right, requires that you surrender control and that you be essentially undone by the experience of orgasm.
Interrupt the fantasy that sustained you in order for you to be able to imagine a better justice. So Janice started out with justice, and I'm always moved by Agamben saying in his work on witnessing, where he says, the performance of justice is really there to provide you the satisfaction that a decision happened. It's not actually a delivery of justice. It's not actually a delivery of the pleasure of the possibility of flourishing together. It's that at least something happened. It's like the minimal event.
Okay, so she's coming from a left-wing socialist perspective, but there's still a lot of good stuff here.
Of something happening. So it's not even justice that we can imagine right now, because we don't even know what the terms of collective life can be that the world can sustain and that we would fight.
Okay, so she's talking about collective life, and I think most right-wingers would want a more corporate, a more collective life. They just would want people to have more freedom to be able to choose the community and collectivity and corporate community that they belong to, right? People who need people are the happiest people in the world, right? People who have other people in their life successfully getting along with other people are, generally speaking, happier and more productive, right? Generally speaking, a group strategy works out superior to an individualist strategy.
For the world to sustain. So what's really interesting is that all of the papers, and in some way we're trying to think about what it means to have a kind of, affective or aesthetic interruption, so that you could walk around and figure out what could be preserved and taken out of that place to be the building ground, the affective building ground for the new life, and the new good life that we could then actually fight for. And so I'll just close by saying, let's see, I have to see. I just saw my cat here. Let me see. So speaking of the good life. Is he calling you? He's calling me. That's right. Yeah. Oh, I talked for too long. Okay. So I'll just, he's sitting there looking at me going, feed me. Yeah. But you're not here, so now I'm going to really beat you up when you come home. So I think, so one of the things we could think about is the how to effectively deal with what's unbearable, which is the loss of our object world. And not to just be overwhelmed by the loss of that object world, but to see that loss as the opportunity for building new.
So I know men who don't want to date and don't want to relate because of the pain of the breakup of an emotional relationship was greater than they can handle. They don't want to go through it again.
Better objects for optimism. And what the aesthetic was in all of these papers, that the aesthetic technological was in all of these papers, was the kind of interruption that allowed people to feel a kind of absorption in the possibility that the artwork made to feel otherwise and to represent otherwise. And I think its relation to criticism and political theory is, and to create forms for magnetizing new optimistic affects that we could trust. So that's my response to you.
So this is the late professor of affect, fancy academic term for feeling, Lauren Berlant. And you'll be thrilled to know that there is a New Yorker essay about her. It's called Affect Theory and the New Age of Anxiety, How Lauren Berlant's Cultural Criticism Predicted the Trumping of Politics. This was published March 18th, 2019.
In October 2011, the literary scholar and cultural theorist Lauren Berlant published Cruel Optimism, a meditation on our attachment to dreams that we know are destined to be dashed. Berlant had taught in the English department at the University of Chicago since 1984. She had established herself as a skilled interpreter of film and literature, starting out with a series of influential, interlinked books that she called her National Sentimental Trilogy. A sense of national identity, these books argued, wasn't so much a set of conscious decisions that we make as if it was a set of compulsions, attachments, and identifications that we feel. In Cruel Optimism, Berlant moved from theorizing about genres of fiction.
Yeah, that's so important. Our most important allegiances are not rationally thought through. They are experienced primally, meaning loyalty to family, to extended family, to community, to tribe, to nation. All right, nationalism is not something that's primarily rationally thought out with a disengaged, reflexive, buffered identity, using strategic, autonomous approaches to life. All right, our sense of communal identity. All right, our most primal loyalties are not the product of reason.
Fiction to theorizing about genres for life. We like to imagine that our life follows some kind of trajectory, like the plot of a novel, and that by recognizing its arc, we might in turn become its author.
That is so good. We like to believe that our lives follow a trajectory, and by recognizing the arc of our lives, we can somehow become the author of our lives. So this is more of an enlightenment, rationalist, strategic, autonomous, liberal perspective that we can be the author of our lives. I think the more right-wing you are, the more at ease you are with the vulnerability of life, the weakness of reason, and we will have less optimism about the individual's ability to author his life.
But often what we feel instead is a sense of precariousness, a gut-level suspicion that hard work, thrift, and following the rules won't give us control over the story much.
Okay, so we don't get to control our lives. We can have some agency over our lives in different parts of our lives, but we don't get to control the whole thing because our lives are interlinked with other people. That's why I don't love the individualist approach to life or to understanding how the world works. I prefer the tribal, national understanding that we are not primarily individuals with, God-given inalienable rights. We are primarily members of a nation or members of a tribe, and whatever rights that we can develop are contingent depending upon circumstances and are going to be historically changeable, right? Depending on the situation, you're going to have access to more or fewer rights.
Let's guarantee a happy ending. For all that, we keep on hoping.
So I think people on the right have a less optimistic view of human nature and so have a more resigned understanding of the tragic nature of life, while people on the left, with their belief in a strategic, autonomous, buffered, rational identity, that individuals have these inalienable rights or should have, right? The people on the left tend to have a much more optimistic view of human nature and tend to be less well equipped to deal with tragedy. So many people on the left have given up on politics because it's just become too painful for them. When communism has been tried, it's not worked out well. So many people on the left have transferred their allegiances to campaigning for human rights. It's a way to retain the primordial impulses behind left-wing politics, but transfer them to a realm outside of politics and make up this idea of human rights and then fight for human rights.
Hoping, and that persuades us to keep on living. The persistence of the American dream, Berlant suggests, amounts to a cruel optimism, a conditioning when something you desire is actually an obstacle to your own flourishing. We are accustomed to longing for things that we know are bad for us.
So one thing I notice in all, pretty much all dramatic movies, plays, TV shows, novels, is that what creates the tragedy is that the individual protagonists don't have any higher transcendent purpose beyond the satisfaction of their own desires. So I came to this insight after years in 12-step programs. So one part of the ethos behind the 12-step program is that there should be a transcendent purpose to your life beyond satisfying your own desires, that frequently pursuing your own desires will lead you to self-destruction. And so we are offered instead the transcendent purpose of being of service to other people. Transcending your own desires can come from an allegiance to a political or religious or cultural ideology or pursuit, but people tend frequently to get into a great deal of trouble pursuing their natural desires, their optimistic delusions, if they don't have anything above their desires, which is something that religion offers.
Like cigarettes or cake. Perhaps your emotional state is calibrated around a sports team like the New York Knicks, and despite hopes that next season will be better, you vaguely understand that you'll be let down anyway.
So anyone whose primary purpose in life, or a substantial part of their purpose in life, or a substantial part of their meaning in life, or a substantial part of their identity in life comes from allegiance to a sporting team is in a great deal of trouble. I mean, that's a really bad basis for living. And so I inevitably find that the more extreme someone's devotion to a sporting allegiance, right, the more troubled the person is, the more of a loser they are who wants to shed this unwanted self and dissolve themselves in this supposedly superior championship team.
But our Sisyphean pursuit of the good life has higher stakes, and its amalgam of fantasy and futility is something that we process as experience before we rationalize it in thought. These feelings, Berlant says, are the body's response to the world.
Right. So that is a trad perspective. So the left-wing, liberal, modern perspective on life is that we can strategically, autonomously, through our buffered identities, reason our way to being the captains of our ship. The traditional perspective on life understands that reason is weak, that we are part of a nation or a tribe rather than individuals, that we don't have nearly as much power over ourselves as we imagine, that our reason takes place within the body, that we have all sorts of pre-cognitive impulses and directions and impetuses before we can even start to reason that shape how we react, such as the effect of our genes and the effect of our early imprinting and the effect of incentives around us of which we might not be conscious. So what she's alluding to here is a much more foundational part of the right-wing perspective on life, even though she is a socialist.
Something you're always catching up to. Cruel optimism was dense and academic, but it proved enormously influential. Its timing was serendipitous.
Look, do you still paint your face in Aussie cricket team colors on game day? I've never painted my face, and I don't believe I've ever worn a sporting paraphernalia like a shirt.
The book was published at a moment when Barack Obama could still credibly draw upon the audacity of hope, and with a second term in sight, people wondered if he would finally unleash the progressive will that many believed lingered deep inside him. Those who opposed him continued to work themselves into a radical frenzy, as the Republican mainstream reoriented itself around the Tea Party. Berlant tuned into a wider sense of disaffection, the feeling among average voters that neither of these visions for change was really about them or for them. According to Berlant, these suspicions manifested themselves in mundane ways. Hoarding things or overeating might be attempts to overcome feelings of personal powerlessness. And her effective framework was
Yeah, so many of our tactics in life, they start out as adaptive, such as overeating, all right? And I know when I eat too much, the blood rushes to my stomach, which reduces my anxiety levels. Also, I get to distract myself with a lot of pleasure. So what starts out, however, as adaptive quickly becomes a maladaptive strategy for life.
Means of understanding larger manifestations of these suspicions, too. The Occupy movement, which began in September 2011.
So many of us are sustained by cruel optimisms and delusions, but some of these optimisms and delusions are adaptive, and others of them are maladaptive.
Could be seen as a response to the cruel optimism of capitalism, the pent-up outrage of citizens realizing that they'd been chasing nothing more than a dream. In the years that followed, Berlant's interest in the immediacy of what others call felt experience helped explain why people were feeling increasingly unsteady. It was as though they were in relationships that lacked reciprocity. Her work, like the school of thought that had produced it.
So I would suspect the primary reason people feel unsteady is not capitalism, it's not neoliberalism. It is that we have reduced the ability to have freedom of association, and we have reduced rights to private property. And so people have more individualist, less communal identities today. And if we could restore pre-civil rights America and reduce litigiousness, that we would be able to encourage more bonding with others, which would give people a more solid sense of themselves, all right? Trying to have a sense of yourself that is individualist is a much weaker way to create a life than a sense of oneself as a member of a tribe or of a nation or of a community, something larger than yourself. So she seems to be venerating here. She's kind of an interesting combination between the socialist and recognizing the primordial power of all sorts of urges that go on inside of us prior to making cognitive, rational choices.
Was attentive to the buffeting emotional weather of everyday life. Consider our Twitter-fed swings of anger and mirth, the oversharing and moodiness ascribed to younger generations, the paranoia.
So the oversharing of younger generations, all right, these are primarily people who lack normal human connections, all right? If you're tight with your family, tight with your friends, tight with your community, you're much less likely to self-destruct on a live stream or on social media in general, right? The most valuable resource you can have is a sense of self-respect and some fact-based liking of yourself. And this is much more likely to develop when you have a whole series of positive relationships in your life, as opposed to an individualist existence, just trying to construct meaning through the power of your own thoughts.
Stoked by proliferating conspiracy theories, even the emergence of the eternally sad pop star. Shortly after the publication of Cruel Optimism, Berlant began to sense.
So I noticed that allegiance to a pop star much stronger among people outside of traditional religion than people inside of traditional religion. People inside of traditional allegiances and traditional identity have much less need for parasocial relationships in general, including to pop stars.
A subtle atmospheric disturbance. In September of 2012, she offered a diagnosis on her blog. Many of you would say that Donald Trump was excluded from the Republican convention, has no traction as a political candidate, and is generally viewed as a clown whose spewing occasionally hits in the vicinity of an opinion that a reasonable person could defend. But I'm here to tell you that he actually won the Republican nomination and is dominating the airwaves during this election season. He is not doing this with dark money or coke-like influence peddling. He has done this the way the fabled butterfly does it, as its wing flapping sets off revolutions. Berlant felt Trump's spectral presence everywhere, his bluster mimicked and channeled by the party establishment.
Okay, a great comment in the chat that Swifties may be more loyal than most Christians these days. Well, to the extent that's true, why is it true? It's because loyalty to Taylor Swift and attending her concerts is providing more of a sense of community and identity and meaning and purpose in life and connecting them more to people that they want to be connected to than being a Christian, right? Taylor Swift is outcompeting Christianity to the extent that what you said is true.
Though hardly a man of nuance, he had tapped into the subtleties of effective politics. She called it the trumping of politics. Literary criticism used to be centered on meaning. The critic interrogated a poem or a passage and applied her preferred theory of how meanings were produced and where they could be found. A new critic might have scrutinized form and irony, explicating the interplay between overt and actual meaning. A deconstructionist might have been attuned to the way the metaphors and propositions in a passage undermined each other. A historicist to the way the meanings of a text might be situated within larger political or social tensions. For each, the task was interpretation, and the currency was meaning. In the past couple of decades, however, a different approach has emerged, claiming the rubric affect theory.
Okay, I don't think I'd heard about affect theory prior to my explorations recently, but I'm intrigued.
Under its influence, critics attended to effective charge. They saw our world as shaped not simply by narratives and arguments, but also by non-linguistic effects, by mood, by atmosphere, by feelings. The so-called affective turn was propelled in no small part by a series of essays starting in the mid-1990s.
So I think this touches on a perennial theme of this show over the past few months, the power of the non-linguistic, right? The power of primal emotions and all sorts of things that move us prior to our having an ability to start thinking in words.
90s by the late Eve Kosofsky-Sedgwick, who had become fascinated by the work of the psychologist Sylvan Tompkins. He had identified 9 primary affects, some positive, interest, enjoyment, most negative, anger, fear, shame, disgust, dissmell, 1 neutral, surprise. Tompkins, who had a background in theater, believed that people acted toward one another according to social scripts. We could achieve peace or happiness by understanding how the scripts worked and by avoiding situations
I think that's true. We do largely relate to one another according to social scripts, and your ability to understand the appropriate script for your situation is frequently the difference between losing or winning in that interaction.
That triggered negative effects. But literary critics like Sedgwick were less interested in figuring out how to make people better than in understanding why we feel the way we do. During the 2000s, affect theory became one of the dominant paradigms of literary studies and a bridge to other fields, notably social psychology, anthropology, and political theory. Scholars like Sarah Ahmed, Sian Nye, and Anne Svetkovich began exploring the emotional contours of life during increasingly precarious times. They were circling around a kind of overstimulated numbness, considering everything from what it meant to call something interesting, a hedge against actual judgment, to the relationship between economic anxiety and mental health.
So why are we overstimulated? Why do we seek to get more stimulation than is good for us? A large part of that is lack of normal human connection. All right, the more rooted you are in your family, extended family, community, friends, your profession, your hobbies, your interests, your educational community, right, the less need you have to go outside of those vital primal human connections for stimulation.
Health. In Ugly Feelings, 2005, Nye published a bestiary of effects, including animatedness, envy, irritation, paranoia, and the combination of shock and boredom that she called stuplimity. Other affect theorists noted that, amid a sense of dawning futility, many people seem to derive their greatest pleasure from making others feel bad. Disaffection and disillusionment are contagions we can spread ourselves. Berlant roots her version of affect theory.
So why would many people get more pleasure from making other people feel bad? Because they want to induce in other people what's going on with them. All right, we're always broadcasting. All right, we're always sending out signals to others. If we're basically happy, we're going to want other people to be happy. If we're basically miserable, we're going to want other people to be miserable. So that's why you can make a good case for the moral obligation to try to reduce your miserable level and try to increase your happiness level.
Less in works of psychology than in works of Marxist thought, especially those of Raymond Williams, who back in the 1950s wrote of the structure of feeling. He was trying to describe how we come to agree on social or cultural conventions, the intuitive, pre-ideological sense a cohort has that one version of the future is feasible while another is not. Berlant, in turn, sought to chronicle dramas of adjustment that have overtaken the post-war boom-time conceptions of the good life, and that might force into...
Okay, dramas of adjustment. All right, having dramatically more immigration, overturning the old constitution for a new civil rights constitution, right, limiting the rights of private property, limiting rights to freedom of association in the name of this new litigious, intrusive, big government civil rights industrial complex, right, that's going to cause a lot of dramas of integration.
To being new recognitions of what a life is and ought to be. The draw of the American dream.
Okay, what a life is and what it ought to be, that is something from a traditional perspective exists outside of us, and we adjust to it rather than the modern liberal left consensus that we can create that with the power of our reason through our own, individual buffered, reflexive, distant identity.
Dream, in her view, has always been its seductive invitation to fuse one's private fortune with that of the nation. When she began teaching at the University of Chicago in the mid-'80s, Ronald Reagan spoke confidently of a morning in America, and the American story of post-war prosperity still seemed possible. General skepticism about meritocracy and opportunity, felt most acutely by marginalized groups who couldn't see themselves in picket fence campaign ads.
So what type of person would bewail American meritocracy? Like what type of group? All right, one that's not cutting it. Right? If you're cutting it, you have no problem with being judged on merit. But if the merits of what your community is producing are quite minimal, while the social havoc that your community is producing are quite maximal, you're going to have a dramatic psychological need to blame your problems on something outside your community.
Ads had yet to go mainstream. Berlant saw the contradictions within the public realm played out in sentimental fiction. These works were often seen as unserious, because of their appeal to emotion and their focus on the domestic sphere, and yet they could move people to act. In sentimental fiction, we encounter righteous solutions to problems that feel unresolvable in real life. Berlant held that popular culture had been built layer by layer, from Uncle Tom's Cabin to The Simpsons, upon the assumption that identifying with someone else's stress, pain, or humiliated identity could change you. Popular culture relies on keeping sacrosanct this aspect of sentimentality, that underneath we are all alike.
Okay, that is a dominant strand of American popular culture, and it's also a delusion. Underneath, we're not all alike. Different groups experience the world differently. That is the most basic of observations, yet it's one that the liberal left dominant elitist mainstream academic world rejects as primitive, medieval, and reprehensible.
She observed. Everyone has heartstrings. Over time, she wrote, we have grown addicted to having them pulled, rather than focusing on what the pulling could accomplish by way of political change. We'd replace tangible action with effective experience. What does it mean for the theory and practice of social transformation, she asked in a 1999 essay, when feeling good becomes evidence of justice's triumph? Somewhere along the way, doing good had come to seem irrelevant.
You're going to most often feel good when you're connected to other people. Right? That's the best way, most consistent way to feel good, is to have the best possible relations that you can have with your family, your extended family, your friends, your community, and strangers that you interact with, and people at work. And so there are ways of living, there are adaptive strategies that enable you to have the best possible relations with everyone that you interact with, and that is what's going to make you feel good. How do you feel good? You get on the same page with other people. Then you create a shared reality, right? Even if that's just you meet regularly in the elevator and you exchange a few words about sports or about the weather or about something that's going on that's relatively innocuous. But if you can create a brief shared reality, all right, with someone and get on the same page with them and get into some kind of synchronicity with them, you are going to leave those interactions with more emotional energy than you brought into the interaction. So you will get charged up, they will get charged up. Out of that emotional charge, you will develop a bond. Out of that bond will come an ethic, right? If you can go around continually replacing and restoring and elevating your levels of emotional energy, I'm drawing on the works here of Randall Collins, right? Because you're getting on the same page with people and created a shared reality, all right? Even marching together, doing anything together, right? That brings about a sense of synchronicity, that you're working in a rhythm together and that you're working towards a common goal. You're going to consistently feel happier and more energized. If you lack energy and you lack happiness, it's because you are not establishing a shared reality with other people that you're interacting with. You are not developing a rhythm in your interactions with them, and you're not getting on the same page, and you don't have a sense of connection towards a common goal.
Or maybe just felt impossible. In 2002, Berlant helped found the Feel Tank Chicago, her version of that ubiquitous vehicle of policymaking, the think tank. The collective consisted of academic colleagues, artists, and activists who sought to take the emotional temperature of the body politic.
Right, it's the Robert Putnam Bowling Alone study. Robert Putnam found the more diverse the community, right, the less likely people were to volunteer. The more diverse the community, less likely you will feel safe and at ease and happy in the public space, the less likely you will participate in the public space, the more likely you are to retreat from the public space and watch a lot of television, which does not make for a happy, productive life.
It functioned both as a support network and as a strategy workshop for political depressives. Underneath the playful conceit was the very serious possibility that politics was essentially theater, and that it was basically impossible to opt out of one's part in it. As Berlant later wrote in Cruel Optimism, the political depressive might be cool, cynical, shut off, searingly rational or averse, and yet, having adopted a mode that might be called detachment, may not really be detached at all, but navigating an ongoing and sustaining relationship to the scene and circuit of optimism and disappointment. We dream of swimming toward a beautiful horizon, but in truth, Berlant evocatively observed, we are constantly dog-paddling around a space whose contours remain obscure. What stories do we tell ourselves in order to stay afloat? In December 2007, she started a blog called supervalent thought, dedicated to slowing the world.
Okay, we have no alternative but to create stories to stay afloat. That is why I repeated someone else's observation that a hero story is a biological necessity. Right? We have no alternative but to create narratives that give meaning and purpose and structure to our lives. Right? There is no alternative to having a hero system.
World down, zooming in on its mundanities. Some of its most bewitching posts had a voyeuristic intimacy, cataloging interactions on city streets or in coffee shops, scrutinizing nonverbal cues, gestures, and fleeting expressions, the traces of affect that litter our daily lives. In one post, Berlant recounts an argument between a cashier and an angry customer at a convenience store. The customer leaves in a huff, but forgets his credit card, and the aggrieved yet duty-bound cashier rushes out after him, hoping to get his attention with an unusually loud whistle, the kind that you know requires your fingers. When the cashier returned, Berlant complimented him on his technique. He told us a story about elementary school, she wrote. He said he had had a math teacher who insulted and shamed him. One day she was using him as an example, and he just put his fingers in his mouth and blew. It was an experience that couldn't be easily distilled into lesson. It endured as a lingering effect. Berlant was interested in the atmosphere of scenes like these, acted out by dispirited characters in search of a plot. The Hundreds, Duke, Berlant's latest book, co-written with Kathleen Stewart, an anthropologist at the University of Texas at Austin, grows out of these short writing exercises. Each entry is an experiment in following out the impact of things in 100 words, or a multiple of 100 words. The result is a strange and captivating book. It is an inventory of what Berlant and Stewart called ordinaries, which arise from encounters with the world that are not events of knowing, units of anything, or revelations of realness or facts.
Yeah, sharing a cottage together can do, wonders for your happiness level. This analysis, this whole field of scholarship is an example to me of how there's so much to be learned from academics and from people who have completely different political orientations, right? You don't have to be a socialist to appreciate the frequent profundity of the late Lauren Berlant.
They are records of affect, meditations, manifestos, and prose poems. There are entries on smoothies and weird encounters at the liquor store, digressions on selfies, yoga, and capitalism, a reference to the TV show Search Party and the real estate app Zillow. The authors sift through the detritus of the American dream, the symptoms of cruel optimism. Men at the local deli seem to suspect that life is a set of roadblocks cooked down to a rage. One particularly haunting page recounts an argument that the narrator had with a neighbor over a urinating dog. Another woman walks by, trying to calm the author down and bring her back to the good. His words were spitballs, hers were gently bouncing tennis balls. He was a rage machine, she was a sympathy machine, but she seemed so tired, too, and I could only imagine why. In Berlant and Stewart's hands, affect theory provides a way of understanding the sensations and resignations of the present, the normalized exhaustion that comes with life in the new economy. It is a way of framing uniquely modern questions. Where did the seeming surplus of emotionality that we see on the internet come from, and what might it become? What new political feelings were being produced by the rudderless drift of life in the gig economy? What if millennials were unintelligible to their parents simply because they've resigned themselves to precariousness as life's defining feature?
Okay, that precariousness, all right, does not primarily come from capitalism. Primarily comes from a lack of normal human connections, ties, and attachments and loyalties, from acknowledging oneself as a member of a tribe, of a community, of an extended family, of a nation, rather than looking at oneself as an individual with inalienable rights.
A lot of affect theory is abstruse to the point where you forget that it aims to describe basic facets of everyday reality. Stewart's books have been a notable exception, interweaving diaristic observation and everyday reportage with critical theory. The sentences in Berlant's previous books and articles tended to be very long, conveying the sweeping complexity of her ideas. But she seems invigorated by the neurotic limitations of this form, which produces a kind of frenzied poetry. The Hundreds calls to mind the adventurous, hybrid style of Fred Moten. The book includes a brief poem by him, Maggie Nelson, or Claudia Rankine, all of whom bend available literary forms into workable vessels for new ideas. Berlant leans into the wit and vulnerability on the edges of her previous work. There is nothing I love more than watching someone use their freedom, she writes. I'll coast in awkward transit, family meals, and acrid sex to get next to a freedom.
My God, Fox News is advertising they've got Hans von Spakovsky coming up next. I mean, this is the multiply debunked, discredited so-called expert continually trotted out by right-wing news media. Absolutely pathetic.
I'll fling myself at ordinary monsters if in the crevasse of the mistake I get next to a freedom. We bear each other, hoping to breathe in each other's freedom. The most penetrating moments of the hundreds occur when the authors meditate on what it means to write about life in the first place. Their efforts end up telling us something about what it means to assess our lives without giving up on ourselves. We make a pass at a swell in realism and look for the hook. We back up at the hint of something. We butt in.
Right, so trying to assess your life, right? This is a very liberal preoccupation. Follow your own bliss. You can create meaning on your own from your own strategic, reflexive, distant, buffered, rational perspective. Right? The right-wing approach to finding meaning in life is to understand that it comes outside of you, comes from your tribe, your community, your nation. Right? It comes from being a part of something bigger than yourself and adjusting yourself to this outside structure rather than expecting the world or seeking the world to adjust to you, which is more of a liberal left perspective.
We try to describe the smell. We trim the fat to pinpoint what seems to be the matter here. It's like an asymptote, moving toward but never arriving at the point of convergence. This is, of course, the geometry of cruel optimism, the endless chase for a destination you'll never reach. It's tiring work. When writing fails the relation.
So Bernard says, why isn't there more of a move to ban people over the age of 70 for running for political office? My objection to that is you're saying that people can't be trusted to decide where to bestow their votes. So I would prefer to just allow people to make choices rather than to try to implement rules about who people can vote for or not.
Of word and world, it spins out like car wheels in mud, leaving you stranded and tired of trying. All attachment is optimistic, Berlant argued in Cruel Optimism, because it forces us out of ourselves. From there we enter into the world in order to bring closer the satisfying something that you cannot generate on your own, but sense in the wake of a person, a way of life, an object, project, concept, or scene. The challenge is finding configurations that don't simply reproduce the same old patterns of life. There's a stirring moment at the end of Cruel Optimism when Berlant writes about the book's cover image, a painting that depicts the artist and disability activist.
Okay, that's the New Yorker essay. I was just so intrigued by learning about Lauren Berlant and her body of work. You'll be glad to know I went on a research binge. And here are some of the things I found. There was a big article about her in N+1 magazine, Socialist magazine. Talks about affect theory's center of gravity lies with Lauren Berlant, English professor at the University of Chicago. Her central concept is the title of a 2011 book, Cruel Optimism. It's a distinctively contemporary feeling. Well, if that's true, maybe there's something wrong with our contemporary world, which is not primarily structural. Maybe it's not primarily about economics. Maybe it's primarily about the decline of traditional rights, such as to private property and freedom of association, and the imposition of an enormous and intrusive and litigious civil rights industrial complex. So, according to Lauren Berlant, cruel optimism is the sticky, effective feeling left by the slow decay of once stable forms of the good life. Yes, I would agree with that because we have less of a sense of community than we used to. We have less social trust and less social cohesion, thanks in large part to inordinate amounts of immigration combined with the civil rights industrial complex. So cruel optimism is a relationship of attachment to compromised conditions of possibility, whose realization is discovered either to be impossible, sheer fantasy, or too possible and toxic. Or you're more likely to be vulnerable to cruel optimisms if you're believing that you can create meaning and purpose from inside your own head rather than attaching yourself to a structure of meaning that exists primarily outside of you in a tribe or a nation or a community. So however harmful an individual attachment might be to a relationship, to an ambition, to a way of life, giving up on it would shatter the personality that has been organized around it. So do we want to organize ourselves where there's nothing higher to ourselves than the satisfaction of our desires, or do we want to organize our lives around transcendent pursuits that go above and beyond and are more important than our own visceral desires? So according to Berlant, whatever the form of attachment is, the continuity of the form, it provides something of the continuity of the subject's sense of what it means to keep on living and to look forward to being in the world. Yeah. To me, happiness, my favorite definition of happiness is the one I think I came up with. Happiness is looking forward to the day or looking forward to tomorrow. Taking on an impossible debt load to buy a house or to go to college because you don't believe you'll have a stable or normal life without it, this is cruel optimism. The graduate student's single-minded, misery-inducing pursuit of one of the few remaining tenure-track jobs is cruel optimism. So one of the approaches to life that leads people to 12-step programs like Debtors Anonymous is, I'm going to graduate school. And affect theory captures academic life. Academia is undergoing the process of the colonization of feeling. I don't know what that means. Grandest example of cruel optimism is found in our collective relationship to a looming climate catastrophe. Okay, cruel optimism describes a way of life under neoliberalism. Right, I don't see that. And then we had the New Yorker. Oh, okay, Erin Maglaque. Right, I played video of her earlier. She writes in the London Review of Books, in academia, reputation is gossip about who had the ideas. So I earlier read her observations on Obama and Oprah, part of a shared national sentimentality. The most influential book, Cruel Optimism, describes the relationship that exists when something you desire is an obstacle to your flourishing, such as romantic love, fast food, the Democratic Party, prestige TV. Each offers its comforts and securities, but each diminishes in us large or small ways, making false promises and prevents us from striving for something better. Yet we continue to strive, blame ourselves when things go wrong. We accept casual contracts instead of hoping and seeking a more secure position. Explains why we spend $10 on a cup of coffee. All right, so you say, wow, 40, this Lauren Berlant, she just sounds amazing. Surely there's more where that came from. What else does Lauren Berlant have to offer us? And you're in luck. I think I've got more. No, not in luck. Let me catch my breath here and find what I want to play.
Riva Lehrer, lying beside her dog Zora. Lehrer seems to float behind Zora, her hand covering her face. Zora is blind in one eye and wears a cone around her neck. They are, by conventional standards, limited and vulnerable beings. But to Berlant, they are a team. They seem at peace with each other's bodily being and seem to have given each other what they came for: companionship, reciprocity, care, protection. In the absence of real stability, the state of affairs...
I mean, that's what we have going on here. We're at ease with each other's bodies, and we extend to each other all those great things that the New Yorker article was just talking about. All right, this is from the University of Chicago, why chasing the good life is holding us back.
In the morning. What motivates you to go to a job you may not love? Save up to buy a house.
Maybe because you have obligations that should transcend your own petty desires.
Or a luxury car.
Maybe because you have obligations that transcend your own petty desires.
For most Americans, it's a desire to attain the quote-unquote good life.
From the moments you live, not the things you own.
But what if that promise that you can have the good life if you just work hard enough is a lie?
Starting in the 1970s, the image of the good life as an economic good life started losing its traction.
Lauren Berlant is a professor of English at the University of Chicago. She spent her career theorizing and writing about finding meaning in American life and whom our society decides gets to be included as citizens.
I mean, there's this whole question of being deserving, which I find so terrifying, was so much a part of the politicization of the good life.
Berlant says that our society and individual sense of place in the world have been shattered in the last few decades, but she wants to find a way to reshape things.
You know, insofar as like I work with art and work with theory, my interest is in trying to produce better ways of thinking about what a good life would be that didn't depend on achievement and success and these kind of very kind of beef jerky-like models of how people live.
From the University of Chicago, this is Big.
Right, that's what religion, traditional community used to give people. Why not restore more incentives for building community with your own?
Bourgeois nationalists and Zionists, and they like ran guns for the Israelis. So there was a
Wait, here she's talking about her.
In America. Who gets included in society and who gets excluded? How do we find meaning in this experience? These are questions that Berlant has been asking her entire life.
My grandparents on my father's side were communists from Russia, and my grandparents on my mother's side were bourgeois nationalists and Zionists, and they like ran guns for the Israelis. So there was a lot of citizenship talk in the family, and I was 11 in '68. So I came into kind of adult-y consciousness, political consciousness, like during a period when people were really fighting about it. And so there was just a lot of that kind of conversation. And I think it really matters if you're coming up during a time of movement culture.
The first books Berlant wrote were called her National Sentimentality Trilogy. They grappled with questions like, what are the relationships and responsibilities that we have to each other? And how are those bonds formed?
Thinking about belonging and attachment to life and the attachment to living on, how one lives on, has been incredibly important to me. You know, some people think they're attached to each other because of the way the law makes a web of constancy among them. So we're all citizens. What does that mean?
So many people get a substantial part of their meaning in life from being a fan, and nationalism is an extension of fandom. So there's a new book out by a liberal left professor, Paul Campos. It's called A Fan's Life, The Agony of Victory and the Thrill of Defeat. It's about his experience on a University of Michigan football Reddit board. And it gets a review in the May 18, 2023 London Review of Books. It says that Adam Smith's famous metaphor of an invisible hand guiding markets was one of the Enlightenment's many appeals to a fictional outsider, supposed to be a barometer of value. So the Enlightenment places a great emphasis on the pursuit of neutrality and objectivity. You've got the discipline of economics that has historically assumed that markets are instruments of justice, that the price system is oblivious to the cultural identity or political status of its participants. And so this is part of the Enlightenment project to make life increasingly rational. Now, the anxiety buzzing around in the background of this book, A Fan's Life, is that fandom has increasingly entered the public square, has now infected American culture and politics at large. So we've seen liberalism give way to neoliberalism. So neoliberalism is cutthroat politics, cutthroat economics, more free market economics than even classical liberalism. So now our elites are no longer, our middle class, our bourgeoisie are no longer given the task of sustaining ideals of fairness and balance, but instead have become more like fans. They are instead given the task of whipping up enthusiasm. So online, there is sufficient space for every opinion and for every claim to be published and articulated and live streamed. So what need now is there for anyone to look down on these claims from a position of disinterest, such as the objectivity that the mainstream news media supposedly has? So fandom has increasingly become the norm. The internet is less a marketplace of ideas, as conservatives and libertarians would have it. It's become much more a marketplace of passions. This has significant knock-on effects for the rest of the media, especially the liberal media that once sought to distinguish themselves in terms of their commitment to neutrality, to critical distance, to facts, right? These Enlightenment virtues, right? These Enlightenment values that go against a public sphere awash with fandom. So nationalism is a form of fandom. It rebels against the constraints of the liberal construct of liberal reason, of liberal allegiance to neutrality and objectivity, because nationalism expresses an unapologetic bias for one side against the other. So outrageous conservative media outlets such as Fox News and Breitbart have nourished the sense that nobody is free from bias and prejudice. It's only the liberal elite who ever pretended to be so in the first place. The internet isn't just a space where fans debate with one another. It's also where tribes build up a distorted and hateful picture of their enemies. So sports allegiances are a sublimated form of politics, and politics are a sublimated form of fandom of the more traditional kind. And so the mentality that distrusts all claims to neutrality and objectivity ends up seeing corruption everywhere, which is a pretty stimulating point. All right, back to Lauren Berlant.
A few years ago, a student and I taught a class called Queer Arts After Stonewall.
Today marks 50 years since the start of riots at the Stonewall Inn in New York.
I think I'll skip that.
Quality, corporate greed, and the influence of big business in politics, spreading to hundreds of cities across America.
People who are starting to think again about, well, what does it mean to be a public? When I was doing my early work, the question of what a public was so important. And then there was a long period, like the last decade, where everyone's like, there's no such thing as a general public, which is related to there's no such thing as a purple America. And I think Obama basically emptied the bottle on the model of citizenship is a kind of meta-category that makes all of us have something in common with each other.
What do you mean he emptied the bottle?
Well, he said there's no red America or blue America, there's purple America.
Even as we speak, there are those who are preparing to divide us. The spin masters, the negative ad peddlers, who embrace the politics of anything goes. Well, I say to them tonight, there is not a liberal America and a conservative America. There is the United States of America.
And now everyone's like, where's purple America? Now, my first 3 books were about national sentimentality, e.g. purple America.
Okay.
You know, the idea that there was some common space that people thought was more or less a fact of a common space. And even if you had different affective relations to it, like you might hate it or you might like it, you saw that you were attached to it. Where everybody because everybody is holding the same songs or the same images or the same fantasies, they have something in common with each other. I think that's been pretty shattered. So we're living without national sentimentality for the first time since the 19th century, maybe the late 18th century.
Right now we're not.
Right now.
And tell me what you mean more by that. We're living without national sentimentality.
We're living without a normative sense that to be American means to have something in common with other people who are members of the set.
And we don't have that anymore.
I think it's been completely wrecked. And that's one of the great...
Yeah, so you can think in large part the civil rights industrial complex and inordinate levels of immigration, frequently of people who is not well equipped to thrive in our modern economy. So Benny Johnson posts on Twitter, August 11, Richmond, north of Richmond, is the most listened to track in the world in the past 24 hours. This American working man's protest song has millions and millions of plays, sung by an off-the-grid farmer in the countryside with his dogs. And Nathan Cofnas responds, main point of conservatives' new favorite song is that rich men have devalued and taxed the dollar. That in America, most taxes are paid by the rich, and even our poor are rich by global standards. An off-the-grid Virginia farmer who can spend more than the annual household income in most countries on recording equipment for his music hobby. Right, 40 years ago, an American hillbilly would have been lucky to own his own harmonica that cost less than a 1-week supply of this guy's beard wax. Populists on both the left and the right can't articulate what irks them, so they invent economic grievances and blame these rich men north of Richmond for forcing them to sit out here and waste my life away. I think I agree with that Cofnas critique.
Effects, by which I don't mean one of the good effects, of the current administration.
Democrats produce mobs, Republicans produce jobs.
Increasingly, we Americans occupy alternate universes.
But you also had people that were very fine people on both sides.
And there's a rejoinder here. Question, either the super rich don't pay taxes because they have high IQ and have good accountants and lawyers, or they pay the most taxes. Which is it? That's very easy. It is the super rich and the rich who pay the most taxes. Now, they may not pay as many taxes as you would like, but taxes are overwhelmingly paid by the rich.
No, that is asking the question again of, you might be here, you might be in the same space as me, but it doesn't mean we both belong to this space.
When Mexico sends its people...
Okay, so Los Angelinos have nothing in common. Right? Half of Los Angelinos, I don't think, can even speak English. So when you can't even share a common language with someone, that you're in the same physical geographic space, doesn't mean that you have much of a bond, right? That's no basis to build meaningful relationships when you can't speak the same language.
They're not sending their best.
They're bringing drugs, they're bringing crime, they're rapists, and some, I assume, are good people.
And the Ministry of Cruelty, or whoever makes his decisions, has decided to float the idea of giving up birthright citizenship. You know, to me,
the Ministry of Cruelty. Okay, cruelty to whom is kindness to others, right? By employing some standards about who gets to become an American citizen. By, I would say that allowing citizenship to people who are in the country illegally, right, is cruel both to the majority, to the existing citizenry, and cruel to those who abide by the rules of the law and try to immigrate to America legally. So I would not say denying birthright citizenship is just some gratuitous cruelty. To me, it is kind to those who deserve kindness, and it is tough to those who deserve toughness.
That's just a kind of astonishing moment in dialing back what constitutes belonging, that you have to earn belonging now, that it's not something that you show up for. And it has.
Yeah, that's a right-wing approach. You earn belonging. It's not just something that you show up for, right? That you should earn your way. That if your group overall is consistently producing havoc, is consistently absorbing more tax dollars than it contributes, it's understandable why people outside your group would not be positively attuned to your group, right? Yeah, individuals and groups should have the mindset of earning their way in life and not just expect everything to be given to them because they have certain inalienable rights, or they can construct emotionally or legally or rationally or politically compelling arguments.
Has to be fought for, because you can see the incredible vulnerability.
If the way that you operate your life is against my best interests, why should I have positive feelings about you? If the way that your group behaves is against my best interests, why should I be positively attuned to you? This is insane what she's suggesting, that groups and individuals, just because they're in the same geographic or nation-state regime, that therefore we should just love one another and pull together, right? If you're consistently against my best interests, why would I support you? Why would I love you? If your group consistently acts against my best interests, right? Every form of life wants to construct an environment that is best suited to its own thriving, and so every form of life naturally has a negative reaction to those other forms of life that destroy its optimal environment. This is library, right? If you go to the library to try to study and to learn, you will naturally have a very negative reaction against protesters and activists who disrupt your ability to study and to learn.
Of people who don't have it as a protection. And I think it's a really big question now. What are our names for the thing that we hold in common?
One of the forces driving the break.
What do we have in common, right? The best predictor of people getting along is genetic similarity, followed by cultural, religious, political solidarity, right? The more you have in common, the more likely you are to get along with other people. That's it.